Welcome back. This is episode 8 of Open Betas with Regal and Swimfan. I am Regal.
And I am Swim Fan.
Should we do like background introductions? Like, because
Like
like
every
on some
time,
shows,
like who we
yeah,
are.
they like explain who they are. Yeah, I feel
Um,
like it's probably not that important, but
you could do like a one sentence thing, right?
oh wait, I forgot about the tagline.
Game of life and life of games.
Yeah, well, a podcast about the life of games and the game of life.
Right. That makes more
Uh,
sense.
well, I guess it's about the same, to be honest, but
That sounds better though.
it's
Putting
the
the big one at
yeah.
the end. That's good.
Um, well, I guess since we already talked about it, we have to do the intro now.
Uh huh.
I don't work in games yet, but I am a software engineer at a very large tech company.
And I Swim Fan am no longer working at any gaming companies. I used to work for some big gaming companies as a marketing person, but I have given
The
that all
big game
up.
companies.
The gaming
We'll be talking
companies?
about the big
Activision,
gaming companies.
right?
Yeah, we'll be
Okay.
talking about one of them today, actually.
I didn't work at, well, I guess technically I worked at Activision
Yeah,
Blizzard.
right.
Totally different, like
A
completely different
technicality.
place. Yeah.
Right. Well, who can say at this point which one was better? But
Hmm.
Um, so today,
Probably Blizzard.
well, yeah, probably still Blizzard, even with all the. For sure, if you are not a woman
They had problems there too, didn't they? In Blizzard, or they have
in
nothing.
Activision.
Uh, no,
Well, Blizzard
the
Blizzard is the one that had all the weird.
yeah, that was them. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I mean. Like, Blizzard is definitely better if you're not a woman, right? If you are, then maybe I don't know what it is between Activision and
I
Blizzard.
think Activision's probably as bad, if not worse, but they
I
just
see.
don't have the same ability to speak up, maybe. So it's even worse. So it could be even worse.
That's great.
So
That's
just that's
oh,
me.
that's
I'm
very
gonna get
positive development.
I'm gonna get sued for libel.
You're liable to get sued for libel.
I am quite liable for libel. All right, let's jump
Yes.
in. What are we
So
talking about today?
yeah, where are we? Who am I? So today I wanted to discuss this concept that I found interesting back in the day. So the concept is this idea of they added what are called legendary items in Legion. And we'll go over what they are. I
Huh?
guess that's way too specific. So Legion is a World of Warcraft expansion.
Hmm.
World of Warcraft is an MMO. MMOs are a type of game.
I think you covered
Uh,
it. Yeah,
I think that's on the back. I think that's enough background.
it's a big one. You
So
may
yeah,
have heard
they
of it.
yeah. So World of Warcraft Legion came out in 2012, and in this expansion, they released a system of legendary equipment, and we'll go over what they are and the specific effects and how um, there was a big. This was a shift because they added a layer of RNG tied to your performance that had never. Def. I guess you can't say for certain, but almost certainly had never existed in WoW up to this point. And
At
I
least
want to
not
talk
to the
about
same extent for
right,
everyone.
right, right.
Uh,
It WoW
so
historically has been a very anti RNG drop kind of game. I mean, there's obviously
uh-huh.
some tied to like progression. Like obviously, when you kill a boss, only a certain number of the items drop, and you can get lucky or unlucky. But I think legendaries took it up to order of that magnitude higher level. So we'll talk about that.
Okay, and for a little context, you how much WoW did you play?
So I played. I guess it's hard to quantify how much. Maybe maybe 1,000, 2,000 hours.
Ooh.
I played a lot during, but that's in total. That's including private server in high school. It's
Uh-huh.
including Kata, and that's including Legion, which I mostly played by myself because I was I was not in the U.S.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And then I played a little bit. Oh no, I didn't play BFA. I played more Legion when I got back to the US and tried to get into the rating scene. But mostly I played like fairly casually, I would say. Mostly solo content. I think the solo content was quite fun. I think the system actually did quite well in the solo content,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
which is its own which is good, but which came up with its own issues.
But you
But yeah,
never
I
you
played.
never really got into the big group content
No, I
though.
never got into
Didn't have the
only a little bit at the
players for
end.
that,
Yeah, but
or didn't. Why
right.
not?
There's several reasons. Well, one, I was in China, so
Oh yeah.
I like time zone for one is an issue. Language for Chinese groups, language is an issue for me because I can't really speak Chinese that well or read
Uh-huh.
it at all. And there's also the Great Firewall. So with the firewall, it's hard. I don't remember. I don't remember if I did play on the U.S. servers or not. But anyway, there was a lot of lag, frequent disconnections, and or if I was on the Chinese server, I obviously would have to play the Chinese client, which I couldn't do. So um,
All
for
right.
most of the time I
Yeah.
actually played the game, that basically precluded me from doing group activity, which is fine. I actually don't enjoy doing the group activity that much. When
Oh.
I got back to the US, we played for a little bit, maybe like a month or two, and we tried to do raids and stuff. Didn't find it that fun and dropped off.
Oh. Okay.
Couldn't really find a good group.
Oh well,
Too
yeah.
many.
That's a huge part of it, right? I mean,
Right, it
uh,
is for sure.
I never and just for my context, I started playing WoW when it came out for like a month, and then
Yeah.
I ran away from it. I think I've mentioned on here before that I
Hmm.
try not to get into MMOs because they never end, and I can get very
Yep.
addicted to them and don't actually have that much fun usually. So anyway,
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Totally understandable. They tried very hard to make Legion even more never end. So we
yeah.
can talk about that too. This is part of it, actually.
Okay.
But yeah, I actually had fun. Like I think the single, I had a lot of fun playing the solo content. Like I remember one day I was playing. I was living in like a hostel type apartment complex, so it
Mm-hmm.
was like shared washer dryer and stuff like that. So I
Mm-hmm.
put all my stuff in the washer and then I started playing and then I forgot about my stuff for like 4 hours. Uh, so that kind of so it was like fun and it was compelling. But in the stuff I didn't do in the end game rating optimization part of it, the hard content, in other words,
Uh-huh.
it caused some real problems that, uh, and I think it caused problems in two ways. So one is it caused the actual problems, and two is the way Blizzard talked about it, which we'll go over what they actually said, which you happen to dig up, um,
Yeah, and I
which I
watched those
think is
videos, so yeah, we can talk
yeah,
about that.
which I think is problematic in multiple ways. It's not. In fact, I'll ask you to psychoanalyze whether how much of what they said was what they believed in.
Okay.
Since you're
Yeah, yeah,
part of the
I can
PR team.
speak to that.
Cool. So I just want to give some. We've talked a lot about it. I want to give some background to exactly what this is. So the problem. So Legion legendaries are items. They're equipment. You can equip two of them at a time. There's for each class. There's well, I have a screenshot here, but for each spec, for each class, there's like 8 or 10 approximately in total. There are some that are shared across all classes.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so basically, it's like, and they have a well, mostly they have a passive effect, but some of them have a effect that like changes slightly how you play. So like for the example we'll use is the class I played mostly during this, which is Havoc Demon Hunter. So one of the best legendaries says the remaining cooldown metamorphosis, which is your like 3 minute cooldown big damage spell, is reduced by 1 second for every 30 fury you spend. So what this means is you don't have to explain, you don't have to understand the whole thing, but basically it changes your cooldown cycle because it's like instead of waiting 3 minutes for metamorphosis, now depending on how you play, you might get it in 2 minutes and 15 seconds or whatever, 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
That
And
and
that
that's a
changes.
lot of time in
It is.
for
Yep.
your ultimate or whatever it is, or
Yep.
something big.
Exactly.
Uh,
It is
okay.
basically ultimate. Yeah.
And so, just so
So
I
that's basically
understand
what it
these
is.
legendaries,
Mhm.
are they class specific or not?
Both. There are some that are class specific, and there are a couple that are shared across all classes, and there's a couple that are shared across roles or different types of classes. So like there's like
Okay.
leather specific ones, and then there's like a ring, which we'll talk about that is shared by everybody, and then there's some that are like tank specific, etc.
And is your role
But the
like enshrined in the game mechanics, or just in how
Yes,
you
yes.
play? Okay.
So WoW set the standard for the MMO triangle, which I guess is actually interesting to talk about. I have some thoughts about the triangle. And the
Mm-hmm.
triangle is basically tank, healer, DPS, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these roles are hard. They're sort of like League of Legends roles almost. Like they are hard set. There's no hybrid tank DPS really. That's not a
Mm-hmm.
thing that exists, right? Um,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. Hello?
so yeah, hello. I was trying to. I was waiting for a second question, but I guess that's it. But
Oh,
yeah,
no.
so that's yeah, that's kind of what it is. So we'll be focusing obviously on DPS because that's the easiest one to talk about. That's the one that's most linear in what you're trying to optimize, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Um,
it's just most straightforward.
Obviously, there's also issues for tanks and healers, but that's probably not important enough to get into all the details. And also, I don't understand all the details, right? Because I didn't really play. I did play healer for a while, but
Yeah, but not to the same extent. The
right.
why I paused there actually was because it's a tangent and we don't need to go down it too far. But
Yeah,
the word tank, I always thought is a
mm,
kind of
that is a weird word.
a weird label, but I can't think of a better one. So
So is DPS, right? Actually, so
yeah, at least DPS
tank,
you could argue is like it makes sense. You're not using an analogy or anything. It's just like this is the damage you
right? I
do
guess that's true.
at this. I
But
mean the.
tank,
Mhm.
I was going to tank as an analogy does make sense given how tanks are used in actual warfare, right? If I understand correctly,
Yeah, like
I'm
they
a
can block the advance of infantry, or like and they're very
yeah,
hard to kill, right? They're very
right.
tanky as we call it, but they also have a big
Like,
ass gun on them that is not
well,
applied to the analogy.
that is fair. I guess I don't really know enough about military history because I'm pretty anti-military history these days to
Oh,
understand what's going on. But my understanding is like the tank's goal is to like go in front and force things to hit them,
yeah, I think
right?
that's right. I think.
Which I guess is sort of the idea. But yeah,
Anyway,
DPS is actually a more weird one because um, it literally doesn't make sense in some cases, right? Because
okay.
sometimes you're like for like DPS is like miles per hour. Like you don't measure. It's hard to. It's kind of weird. For example, if you're buying a car to talk about like, well, how many miles per hour can it go? Actually, I guess that's not weird, but in
Yeah.
some cases, if you literally say damage per second, it stops making sense.
You
So, for
mean
example,
is it the per second part you mean? The fact that
yeah,
okay.
yes. So in a lot of or in Korean games, I know specifically, they have a separate word which translates just to dealer, like damage dealer, which
Mm.
makes a lot more sense. But
Mm-hmm.
dealer, obviously in English, has more meanings, which can get confusing as well.
Yeah. Cool
I
meanings.
think it should just be called attacker, personally. But what do I know? You know?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes more sense. I mean,
Yeah,
it's like RNG. DPS is like you only hear it
yeah.
in
Three
gaming
letter.
circles.
Have we ever talked about three letter? My intense hate for TLAs, three letter acronyms.
I don't think so.
It's not really intense hate, but it's just annoying because at work there's a growing trend to name everything a TLA. Like every new service is like, EFG or PDMA or whatever
Like
instead of like
intentionally, like they want to make
yeah,
sure it has a
yeah.
nice acronym or what?
Because the acronym stands for something that's most descriptive, right? Like,
Uh-huh.
I just picked a random four letters, but like PDMA stands for something that literally describes what the service does, which is cool. Whereas if you name it like a code word, like Project L, for example, it's not descriptive, right? You have to like, it's
Yeah, you have
basically
to get
limiting the
into what
word.
it is.
But it's very annoying because you know, you have a bunch of acronyms now, which are basically the same thing because know what you
Yeah.
don't know what they stand for most of the time, and they conflict and they're hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, in a
So
corporate environment, those things, or at least I've seen it too, of you start getting piles and piles of these codes and
yeah,
acronyms, so you practically speak a different language after a while. But yeah, sometimes people I agree that it can be way overused, that sort of thing.
Corporate America, am I right? Anyway, what were we
Yeah.
talking about? Where
So
am
back to
I?
the
Uh,
legendaries. I don't know.
yeah, how did we get
You
there?
were talking
Oh,
about the triangle.
we
The
did, we
triangle.
actually did get on a tangent about the triangle. Yeah. Anyway, so we're focusing on the DPS portion,
Hmm.
and so the legendaries, most of them are completely passive. So you actually don't know. Obviously, they change a little bit. So I'll give you another example. We'll go over another Shadowhunter accessory. This one is not used. It just says throw glaive deals 25% increased damage for every enemy hit.
Yeah.
This doesn't really change the way you play, really, right?
Yeah, it just
It's
takes the
pretty
number up a little bit.
self-explanatory, and we'll talk about that. But that's kind of what legendaries are. So their goal, but you can see that the numbers sound kind of big, and they are. So they are. I don't know if they're the most important. That's hard to quantify, but they were a very important performance enhancer. When we get to the Q&A, that's I think the asker also says that, right?
So
Having a specific,
you're saying that these numbers, the legendary numbers, are pretty big. I mean,
they are
for
big
context,
in the
I wouldn't
context.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. In the context, they're big. Now,
Okay.
big in this context is like a 5% increase,
Uh huh.
right?
Uh huh.
That's kind of what they're probably less than that, right? Compared to having legendaries that are not performative, but 5% increase in that context is quote unquote big, right? Like you can use the word
Yeah.
big to
Yeah.
describe
When
it,
you're at that level, every little bit is something
right?
meaningful.
But yeah, we can just say meaningful, right? Like significant, meaningful. And how do you get them? Well, that's the problem. The way they're implemented at the beginning, and they kept chipping away at this over time. But in the beginning, they were meant to be rare drops that you were excited to get. And
Hmm.
what that means is you couldn't farm them. You couldn't do anything that gave a higher chance of doing them. You got them from doing any content, like literally anything in the end game zones. So you could do world quests, you could do dungeons, raids. Um, I think people calculated at some point, and like pretty much specifically, they were all mapped out quite well to have the about the same drop rate per time you put in. And if you wanted to farm them, what you would do is you would like just farm world mobs if you just needed a
Right. So
legendary drop.
when you say they can't be farmed, it means that you can't like
Right.
target a specific boss to fight
There's
again and
it's
again.
right, right. They can't be farmed better doing any one thing better than or any one thing more than something else. So there's no specific
Yeah.
content that's
Yeah.
like this is where you go to get. Now, like I said, people did the math and there were ways to farm them. Those ways weren't very fun, but the idea was that you were just get them naturally by doing anything,
Can you give
which
me a
sounds
sense? Can you give me a sense of how rare they are? Like what kind of percentage
hmm.
drop rate there would be?
Yeah. So, well, the way they worked is, I think you would go by time.
Uh
I
huh.
don't. That's a good question. I actually don't remember the details.
Okay. Well.
But I think maybe the idea was like you would get one every like 2 weeks of play or something like that, a month of play. It was much lower in the beginning and it went up over time.
One every 2 months,
Uh,
you said?
no, probably not 2 months. Probably like a month, 2 weeks to a
And
month.
that's assuming you
Um,
play a lot.
that's assuming you play probably yeah like a couple hours a day at least.
Okay. Okay.
That's totally I could be totally wrong because that's just a ballpark because I didn't jump in until they patched a lot of this stuff
Yeah.
and made it they added like bad luck protection or pity and stuff by the time I got in, so you were like guaranteed to get one at a certain rate, but at the
Uh huh.
beginning I do know it's quite rare. And the other thing that we're not talking about is that these are per character, so if you have multiple characters this happens for all your characters.
Okay. And you can't trade between your characters?
No.
Okay.
Well,
Mm.
at least definitely not for the class specific
Oh,
ones.
yeah.
I don't
Okay.
know
Yeah.
how the universal ones are, but I'm pretty sure you can't trade those either. What else? And the one that you got was random. So the bigger problem is okay, you can put in the time to get some legendaries, but that takes a long time, and the one you get may not be the best one. Which, in fact, it's very likely to not be the best one, right? And at the time, it was basically impossible to target how to get the best one.
Do you know how big the pool was? Like how many items we're
Yeah.
talking about?
So,
Like 100?
uh, oh, I forget if you can get. No, it's not 100. It's like it's in the tens, 10 to
Okay.
20. I
Oh, okay.
forget if you
Okay.
could get. I don't remember if you could get a different spec for your class. That's probably too technical, but it's in the tens. So,
All right.
but I do remember Asmongold near the end of Legion made a video in which he talked. I don't remember the details, so I could be misrepresenting this, but basically on some of his characters, despite playing for the entire expansion, he didn't naturally get every legendary.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
so it is
But it's
it was
expected that you more or less should by then.
well, you would think so, right? If you want to reach peak performance. Another point to this is the question that we'll go over about this still being a problem came out 3 years after the initial release, right?
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it was. It may not be a problem for someone who played the same character since the launch, but it was still a problem 3 years after release because at the same time you also have new players, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay. So should we get into what the problem was with these things?
yeah. Actually, I would want to say one thing, which is that these came from Diablo, right? Diablo 3.
Oh, uh-huh.
Diablo. So I looked into my long-standing. Well, it's not really. I think it's quite obvious actually, but Legion has very strong influences, or if you want to use a different word, direct ports of mechanics from
Uh-huh.
Diablo 3. So Legion released in 2016, Diablo 3 released in 2012. So the timeline of Legion's development would coincide probably with right around when Diablo 3 was peaking, right? In
Yeah, that
like
makes sense.
2013, 2014, 2015. So the game, if you look at the game, actually looks a lot like Diablo, and legendaries come straight from Diablo, where the legendaries like change your skills even more, right? They like define the specific type of game, type
Yeah,
of
that
build you have,
series kind
right?
of led that push
Right.
or
Which,
popularized that sort of drop system, rares and
right,
legendaries and such.
right. Which is fine. Like like action RPGs, or like Diablo type style games in general have this mechanic, which is fine. I guess we won't get too into comparing them, but so what are the problems when you sort of port it in this way to WoW? Well, to give some background, we'll be talking about this in the context of like end game progression rating. So
Mm-hmm.
progression means you're doing something like early on as it releases that you haven't cleared yet and that you're not way stronger than. In Lost Ark terms, the opposite would be a reclear. Like the complement would be a reclear, meaning people have done it already. You know what to do. You're just there to get the rewards.
Okay.
So in progression content, the expectation is that content is challenging, meaning what that means is your performance matters, right?
Uh-huh.
Now your performance can be
Unfortunately.
is a factor of your right is a factor of your skill, but it's also a factor of your items, your gear, right?
Yes, so how lucky or how grindy you've been.
Right. Well, in this case, it's that, right? But in the
Lucky. Yeah.
past, that wasn't necessarily the expectation because without the legendary system, in the past, the expectation was generally that you could reach your peak theoretical power or something quite close to it without too much effort compared to what it was after, right?
Mm-hmm.
After legendaries, it became not really up to you whether you were able to reach your peak theoretical power, right?
Yes, right. Okay.
Unless you're willing to put in like 10 times more time than you used to grind these legendaries with.
And so it's not like that. It's not like the legendaries you could get would, I don't know, like indicate what sort of gameplay changes you might make. And many changes were, many of those such changes could be good. Like it was basically like, no, there is a there's one item legendary that is useful for this slot or for this fight. And if you don't get that, the other ones are useless for you, more or less.
Well, I would say their goals are a little bit of a mystery because there's some conflicting ideas here. But the others are not useless. And like we mentioned before, it's not a double your damage type of enhancer. It's like a 5% increase or whatever, right? But the others are not useless. There are some secondary or tertiary performative combinations or whatever. But because they're all largely passive, it's mostly just a number that's smaller, right? It's not really like you can do this other alternative that's harder or that plays a different way that's like comparable. By and large, it's mostly that it's just a smaller number and there's not much you can do about it.
Okay.
So why does the smaller number matter? Well, in progression rating, again, it's supposed to be challenging content. And if the content is challenging, then if you fail, the group needs to figure out why. Now, mostly that's because of people are learning slower than others. People are not playing well because they're in an unfamiliar situation. People are missing mechanics. But one metric that does indicate performance is the amount of damage you do, right? That like this is an important metric because this is what there is an enrage timer and you need to kill the boss within a certain amount of time, which means as a group you need to do a certain amount of damage, right? And there's all kinds of things that come into this, but the damage that a DPS does is like one of the most important metrics that you can have for it. I don't think that's not really a hot take, right? So there's tools in the community that almost everyone uses that like calculate your damage and calculate damage for the whole group and gives you like detailed parsing. This is generally called parsing. Gives you detailed information about like your performance and how you did and stuff like that, right?
What was it called? LOL or WoW? What did he say? Facts? I forget. Oh, logs.
There's a sim.
That's FF logs.
Oh yeah, so logs. Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, logs. They're also called logs. Yeah. WoW was the pioneer of logs. FF logs is the Final Fantasy version. WoW has several loggers, at least when I played.
And now these are community made.
Yes.
Like, do they have Blizzard's blessing, or Blizzard is always like, you shouldn't be doing
Blizzard.
this?
So WoW has a lot of add-on. Has like not even a tacit, a explicit approval of add-ons. In fact, they're like part of the core game, and they're supported by like a team within Blizzard, I assume. To make it hook up to the game. So yeah, they have total approval to do. To make add-ons.
Right. They give out their
changes,
API, right? Is that what you say?
Yep, they sure do.
Okay.
And then the second part is that because you have a performance-based selection, it's competitive. Now it's cooperative at the end of the day. Like you're not trying to kill each other in game or in real life, but that because it's
not until the fight afterwards.
That means, well, yeah. Well, we'll talk about some community drama where people, do often actually try to kill each other in real life. But
okay.
In the game, you are cooperating, but obviously you're also competing because if it's hard, that means you can fail, and if you can fail, that means you can do things better than other people, and that naturally leads to competition, right? That's like human nature. So because it's competitive, people, even if they succeed, they want to have the biggest number possible, right? Like
that's interesting. You mean even if the metrics of the game tell you you've won, they still want to go beyond that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Right. It's there's a separate. See, this is the example I keep wanting to come back to is speedrunners, right? Like, you have a mentality when you're in a competitive situation to do the best you can. It's not really just about. It's not really just about doing what the game tells you to do and succeeding. And we'll talk more about this later. But it's about
go ahead.
Self-improvement is a part of it, right? And the idea of just doing better, always doing better, and doing the best, and seeing where you can improve is also a part of it. Right? So
with the parsing, with all the stats of what you did, can you see any other WoW players' stats, or is it exclusive to you?
Yeah.
And
so
your friends?
the logs.
Okay.
The logs that are uploaded are usually the entire raid, so you can see everybody.
But not just in the raid you played in. I'm saying, like, you could see.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. You can also see. So actually, what's very common is what's called a parse. It's a number that shows up next to your performance and that ranks you against everyone else that's uploaded the log. So it gives you a
So
percentile.
it gets it down to one number. All right.
Yep.
Well, no wonder people are
And
competitive.
there's tons of numbers, right? It's a complex tool with many facets. But yeah, there's tons
Okay,
of
well, because that's all visible, I get it a little more that people are
right,
pushing for that number as
right,
high as possible, even though it doesn't necessarily mean you're not able to beat a piece of content.
right. By the way, Lost Ark explicitly makes it disallowed to do this
Oh,
for the exact reason you might be thinking of, which is they think basically the developers have literally said we think DPS meters only cause toxicity and there's no point to them and you'll never be allowed to use them.
isn't the end of every fight in Lost Ark they say how much damage everyone did?
So they give you a big bucket, right? So the bucket is if you're a fighter in 8-player content, I think it's like 0 to 18%, and if you're at the next level, you're like 18 to whatever, I think like 22% or whatever. And then if you're the next tier, you're like 30% or higher or something, right? But they do not tell you the exact numbers. So if you do no damage at all, if you really suck, you can't really tell, right? And they only show the highest performing players.
Oh, you're right. They don't show everybody's
Yeah, they don't
shitty.
show everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, or else I'd be up
and
there each time.
you can also do. Well, we don't have to get into Lost Ark, but there's intentionally ways to game the system. But the point is that they take the opposite stance to try to quote unquote combat this by just not allowing it at all, right? So that's kind of the problem. So what happens when you combine the competitive nature of group finding with legendaries? Well, your expectation that you'll be able to reach your peak performance is now gone. So you have three options, right? Well, the first option is to just get lucky and be like, oh, I got my bis in my first 2 drops, I'm good. I don't have to think about it anymore.
I'm going to do that option.
That's a great option. Yeah, just get the drop.
Okay.
It's actually but what happens if you don't do that? Well, then you have 2 options. Well, one is you can just do slightly less damage than peak. If you're a good player, like Ian says, then you will be fine. Probably, right? If you're a good player and you're better than the rest, like if you have a skill difference compared to the rest of your group, then the difference in theoretical damage is not will not show up because you will make up for it with a skill difference.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
That's fine. That doesn't feel good though. Like I don't think that's really a solution because, well, your skill difference should translate to damage difference. Like if I'm better than everyone else, why shouldn't I do more damage than everyone else?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Obviously, you might say, well, you can just clear the content anyway. But again, I think that's really ignoring how human nature thinks about these things, right? It's like the speedrunner mentality. It's like, well, you can beat the game. Why do you have to beat it fast? Well, the point is to beat it fast, right? Like I'm putting in the time so I can beat it as fast as possible. In this case, I'm putting in the time and effort and practice so I can do as much damage as possible. It does not feel good that I can't do my peak performance even though I put in more effort.
But
right?
the shittier player who got the drops can do as well as me, and that feels bad.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Which again, this is not a groundbreaking problem. This is not probably not.
No, I mean it's something that
whatever,
comes up a lot, and there's there is a maybe not in this situation, but there can be a pro to that in that
right.
You get to blame someone other than yourself
This is a big thing in fighting games, actually. Yeah. There's like one of the things, and this may not necessarily be true, one of the things that goes around the fighting game discourse is like, oh, well, people don't play fighting games, they play, MOBAs because they get to blame their team when things go wrong, right? Not themselves. But I don't think that's true. If a person doesn't want to blame themselves, they're not going to blame themselves. I mean, that's
that's just exactly.
But so that's the thing. The second thing is, okay, well, in an MMO, the expectation historically up to that point is still kind of true. Is generally that like, okay, well, you need to put in a lot of time, right? That's kind of the conceit of the game. Like, okay, you can reach your peak performance, but you can reach it in a linear way, but you need to put in a lot of time. But it's a set amount of time. It's a linear amount of time, right? It's like every week you need to do these raids, and okay, maybe there is still an RNG component, like maybe you'll never get the specific item you need, but most things you can get something equivalent with time, right?
Yeah, because in MMOs, it's all about getting you to play longer and longer.
Right. Which was also the point of this. I mean, this obviously gets you to play much longer if you want, right? If you get unlucky, now you have to play even longer to get to grind for your legendary or whatever. But the problem is that the time component, obviously, because of the RNG element, can increase to like 10x or 100x what it used to be, right?
Wait, say that again.
Like it's not. The time, like the amount of time it can take you to reach peak performance compared to before, increased by like 10 to 100 times.
Oh wow, that's a
or zero, right? I mean, if you just get it first try, it increased 0 times.
Sure,
right?
But but for most people or for a lot of people, it increases the time quite a bit. Like not just
quite a bit. Yeah,
like orders of magnitude.
Right. Okay. Right. Exactly. Now they added a bunch of stuff to fix this later. I actually don't know the details about what they changed, but I know you could eventually like just buy one. Like you could just pick one that you really needed and you could just buy it.
Okay.
But only one, stuff like that. But at launch, the reason we're having this discussion is I'm trying to get at what what the fuck were they trying to do at launch? Because
clearly they
had launch.
misgivings about it later and changed things. So.
Right. They intended something with this that they like kept going back and back and back on later. What was the goal?
Yeah.
And then the second problem. So the visible part of the problem is that like, well, if you are not performing well and the group is having trouble clearing, then you need to get removed. And you can imagine that this means that if you're not performing well, perhaps because you didn't have legendaries, perhaps not, but you can imagine that people think, I don't have legendaries, that's why I don't have the right legendary, that's why I'm not performing well. And then those people get removed, they will be unhappy, right? They would, whether or not that's realistically the problem.
And it's not like you can really tease out how much of your missing damage is because of the legendary in the numbers, right?
In theory, you can. Like using simulations and stuff, you can. But again,
in practice, it's just I'm going to blame it, whatever it is, on
right,
on that.
Right,
Okay.
Exactly. So whether or not that was a serious problem, that was the problem that people felt, right?
Yeah.
That like, look, players that perhaps are skilled are getting removed from groups because they are not able to perform at their peak because they got unlucky, essentially, right? And that whether or not that was an actual like measurable problem, perhaps it wasn't, perhaps it was, is that it feels bad that your ability to perform at your peak is not under your control anymore, right? At least not nearly as much as it used to be. Okay, so I want to directly quote this Q&A with, I think it's Ian Haziokostas, who was the game director of WoW in 2017, and I think for all of Legion. So this is 2017. This is 3 years after initial release. And yes, the problem still existed 3 years after the release. So the question is this: as many classes' ability to maintain competitiveness is dependent on having best in slot legendary combination, what are your plans to fix the problem of unlucky players being uncompetitive and benched by progression rates?
Yes.
And so...
And we know, do we know? Okay, no, sorry, go on.
So the host, so the way it was set up is like Ian is on the site. The host is a person named Josh Allen, which I thought was really funny if you follow the NFL.
Nope.
Frames the question as so. So the first thing the host says is, the problem is some legendaries aren't as good as they should be. Which I already disagree with, but let me just read out. So this is a direct quote of Ian's answer with a one paraphrase in the middle. So Ian says, that's a huge part of it. It's narrowing those gaps. The ones that are the most problematic in our eyes are the ones that feel like they're universally the best. Sefu's, I think, is in a good place. There are some fights where, this is paraphrasing, the mechanics learn to make it clear that Sefu's is the best option, but you wouldn't necessarily use it in other fights. that's a better place for them to feel overall, rather than to ever feel like there's one universally dominant choice. Okay, so that's the first part. To summarize, he basically said, well, they both basically said, we can fix this problem by making them all perform around the same, and or making some of them situationally better, which we'll talk
like
about.
for specific raids, for example.
So to give more context, Sefu's is a notorious universal accessory that basically said when you CC, so when you stun or root, or when you interrupt, you get a buff. So this is like, clearly that's something that like situationally lines up. So only on bosses where you have to interrupt or dispel or root or whatever, when you can do that, it's good. When you can't do that, which is a lot of fights, it's not good, right? So that's
okay. So there are plenty of fights where that's not an option at all.
Right.
Okay. To CC the boss or whatever. Okay.
Yeah. Well, you can never CC the boss, right? Which is the issue. So only when there's an interrupt or a dispel mechanic, it was good. Right?
Okay.
But when there is, it's better than the other choice. So that's what he's saying. And the second part is separately. He says separately, and I know this is a murkier area, I think the definition competitive is one that is very subject to debate. You might be a few % behind, but I think the reality is for most classes and for most specs, that's well within the margin of error of natural variance in performance from fight to fight, which is a weird thing to say. Of course, you like to do the highest SimCraft DPS if you're in a min-maxing mindset, but I think guilds that are benching good players because their theoretical sim throughput is just a few % behind what they might want are probably not making the right choice. As any raid leader can attest, good players who consistently show up are positive in their mentality, don't fail on mechanics, all those things. They're valuable and hard to find. I will question the choice if that's the path they're going down. That probably isn't actually the best thing for the group's success.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It sounds like he's trying to position the legendaries as if they are I don't know, just like one lever you can pull rather than the thing that goes on top of everything you've done to make you even better. I don't know. Right. It's it feels, he's definitely trying to play down exactly what the person asked. Like, no, they're not that big of a deal, because if you're really managing your raids the right way, they're not a big deal. Like, they don't do, but that doesn't make any sense to why they were introduced, right?
Well, that is certainly a problem. So how much of this, what he said, do you think he actually believed? Like, is this more of like a PR thing, or do you think internally he actually was like, no, this is fine? And everyone was like, yeah, this is fine.
They don't come into those things without preparing, right? Like those aren't off the cuff answers, really. They know what the question is ahead of time, and they've talked about it. And even the fact that Josh Allen, the community guy, led off with the positioning that he did makes me think, oh, this is how we're framing this problem right now. Don't frame it in terms of essentially what the question is, the player's question is getting at. So that's how it feels to me. It feels like, all right, we need to position. There's a problem here, but we shouldn't just position this as, yeah, you know what, we fucked up. This is like a, the idea is good, the system is good, but we didn't do it quite right. So if we even out everything, it'll feel right again. And I guess I want to know from you, Regal, like, how true is that? Like, if you even everything out, does that defeat the point of the legendaries, or is that a better system? I don't know.
Well, it depends on what you might even things out. Well, actually, I want to explore both. So I think he says two things that are actually incompatible. He says, one is he says mechanics or situation will dictate which one's the best. Okay. But then he also says we need to narrow the gaps so that they're all approximately equally performative. Now those things can exist, but if you look at, and we will look at the actual effects on, we talked about one earlier, right? Moarg's Bionic Stabilizer says throw glaive deals 25% increased damage for each enemy hit. It's hard to imagine how that effect can be situationally better than any other AoE effect, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah.
That's not Sephuz's, where it's like, oh well, when you interrupt, you do something. This is just, it does more damage to groups or
Right. The
whatever. I mean,
Sephuz
that's
has like a gameplay implication
right,
or a choice
right,
implication, whereas the other passive damage increases are just that.
right. So because they're so passive, I think if they're completely passive, they can be increased so that they narrow the gaps, which I don't think they did, because I looked at some guides around the time and the uncompetitive legendaries stayed uncompetitive.
Oh, okay.
And because it's a passive, you can just buff it to be competitive. Like instead of 25%, you can just make it 75%,
Yeah.
and it'd be good. If you want to do that, you can do that, right? Alternatively, if you want to make them all situational, then you need. I think there's probably not enough situations where you can have enough variety. We'll talk about that in detail. But I don't. If you take what he said literally, I'm not sure that it makes sense. Like those two things, buffing things so that they all work the same. Also, I think this is more to your point. Can defeat one purpose of the legendaries, which is the idea of like getting something cool, getting the best, right? It's like, I think,
yes, it doesn't feel like much of a win other than like, oh, thank God I have one of these, I guess, so I'm
right.
matched up with everyone else. But yeah, to your point earlier, like just to make sure I'm understanding, so the damage buff ones, like the passive upgrade sorts of legendaries, they go against what he's saying because they don't have any specific use
Right.
for
Right.
or gameplay implication. Okay.
Right.
You're just
They go
doing what
they go
you're doing.
against both of what he's saying, right? They don't really have any specific situation, but they also aren't being buffed to be competitive, which I think would be simple if you wanted to do that, right? Like you could just make the number bigger because you don't have to consider context, right? So that's I'm curious. I feel like sometimes, just from the outside, I feel like there's often this attitude based on what people say in these kind of Q&As, that there's an idea running around inside these game companies that like, man, the community just doesn't understand.
You mean the attitude of the devs
Yeah.
seems to give that
Yes.
off? Did they say that
Yeah.
explicitly, or that's just the impression?
No,
people get?
but like this is the, like this answer, I think I get that impression from strongly, right? Like the answer, obviously, like you said, maybe I shouldn't take it literally. Maybe it's just spin. But the answer feels like, well, you guys really should be thinking about these in a different way.
Right?
And
Yeah, you're playing it wrong.
You guys are prioritizing the wrong things, and you guys don't really understand how to form a good group, right?
Yeah, that's not a successful gameplay addition, right? Like that's not if you're coming out and everyone's saying this is how it really plays and this is how it affects our game, and you're like, we didn't mean it that way. You should look at it this way. You should look at it a different way.
Do you think that's a common mentality, or is it just something that like comes across the wrong way?
Okay, well, in their defense, I would say that there are many situations where the developers do know better than the players. Like,
oh, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we've established that they're the ones designing the damn thing and have the experience and the, etc. But this is something that came up at Riot a lot too. Is the sort of like, well, what do they just think they're just going to tell us, oh, well, this is better for you because we're Daddy Riot or whatever, and we know better.
Right.
And so there has to be a balance, right? Like, is it, and a sifting through the feedback to understand, like, all right, are people truly playing this wrong in a way that we can address by saying, all right, we're going to adjust it, or are we going to try to like tell them to think of it differently? Because the latter is not a really winning position. Like people aren't going to hear that. nobody's gonna
Right.
hear that, like, no, you're wrong. It's actually fine, and feel good about that answer, right?
Right. Right.
So
Uh,
go ahead.
no, I think it's really good that Riot. I think that's exactly the problem, right? Which is that, and I'll give another example. I gave the example in one of the earlier episodes, which is Ice Frog, the and now Valve,
Ooh,
the balance team for Dota.
uh-huh.
Um, they often do this thing where they like make a rework to a hero or a champion in League of Legends parlance, and still no one plays it. Like this is a hero that doesn't get played, right?
Uh-huh.
And they want to make it played more, so they do a rework, they make a buff, and still no one plays it. And then they
Mm.
do a bunch of small little buffs just to keep it in people's sights because,
Hmm.
and what it feels like from the outside is because they feel that they did enough, right? Like they feel like the thing they changed was actually enough, and you guys are just not using it.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
and
that's possible too, but
right.
especially with like an individual champion, like
Hmm.
if there's a lot of stink around that champion from the
Yep,
past.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's because that's a real thing. It's hard to balance, like you said, the idea of when do you, but at the same time, sometimes they also just do this thing where they just give up, right?
Uh-huh,
And I don't
uh-huh.
think that's because the community is too stupid. Like sometimes they're just wrong,
Yeah, yeah, for
and
sure.
sometimes the community is wrong.
Well,
Like one of the most,
and sometimes you see how it bears out over time too. Like when something is just released and people are arguing about it, you don't know. There's
right,
fog of war there. You don't
right,
know really what's
fog of
happening.
war.
Players may I mean, you may need months, you may need a
You
year
do,
to
yeah.
really see if this worked the way you thought it would. Because players don't think in those, usually don't think in those sort of
Hmm.
terms.
One of the best examples is like tier lists for games that just release, right? By top players, no less, and by players that are putting all their time to figuring it out,
Oh yeah, I mean
are
that's
often
just a
completely
guess,
wrong,
right?
right?
Like that's
Yeah.
you just don't
Well,
know
they
what the
don't. The
meta
thing is,
is.
like, if you listen to them talk, this is the influencer problem, right? If you listen to the top players talk, it's not a guess. They're absolutely sure, and they're top players. Of course, you should believe them, right? But in
Right.
reality,
But that's just a marketing thing, right? Like that's I want to keep my viewers. So yeah, I'm an expert. This
uh,
is all right.
I think for some people it's a marketing thing, but I think
You think they
top
truly
players
believe
are
it?
very confident and they truly believe it. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, that could very well be. Yeah.
by and large. But at the same time, the
One
same goes for
question.
devs, right?
Hang on, one more
Oh, go
thing. I
ahead.
just want to finish that thought that it bears out over time. So in this example, this is 4 years later, and people are still
Yeah,
complaining. So
right,
this makes me think it's probably an actual problem, and they are
right.
continually not addressing the what's wrong with it. And it sounds like you
Right.
checked in on this years later, right? And they had made some
Yes.
changes, but it's still not great. Or
It's
did the
not
change
perfect,
sort of
right?
just even things out and make it less of a deal? Big
I
deal?
honestly couldn't tell you
Okay,
enough.
okay.
I do know that at some point it was like it reached a functional state
Hmm.
where like this no longer was a massive issue. I think, but I don't know the details enough to really say, to be honest.
Hmm. All right.
What was I talking about? Oh yeah, so I think that's fair, but I think it's important to remember that that mentality about top players like being way too overconfident about what they know also applies to devs. It can like, there is such a thing as like truth, and sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong, and that doesn't really have to do with which group you come from, right?
Hmm.
Like sometimes the devs are wrong and sometimes the players are wrong, and it's important to not try to just be right, right?
Yeah, I mean that was a thing, with the with the internet being a thing these days.
Right. Yeah.
That game companies have adapted to. Like Riot Games is
Right.
they've gotten better, I think, at being like, hey, this may not even work, and a year from now we may take it away because it sucked. So we're setting that expectation now, and not saying that we know 100% that this is going to be a great feature and you're all going to love it. And
Right.
people appreciate, at least the hardcore community people appreciate that sort of stance usually.
I think the silent portion also appreciates that, to be honest.
Yeah.
I have some. Well, we keep meaning to talk about this idea of like how to get good feedback, right? In the sea of morass that is social media and the internet.
Yes.
And I don't know that I have a great answer. In fact, I'd be curious to talk to like community managers.
This is yeah, me too actually. I'll ask some community managers I used to know. But
Yeah, that'd be very
this also
interesting.
reminds me of the feedback process that we set up for the League of Legends client update. But let's get into that separately. That's a whole
Yeah,
thing.
that sounds a huge, complicated topic,
Yeah.
but also very interesting. So basically, if we go back to Ian's quote, one we already talked about, which is like what he literally said about why the situation is the situation, doesn't make a lot of sense, which we talk about. But the second part, which we won't get into today, is like this idea of, well, the guild should pick their roster based on, for example, success, right? Or attitude, or like willingness to improve, or timeliness, or whatever, which is fair. I think those are true, and those will, like you said, probably lead to better long-term success. But that's often against human nature, right?
Okay.
Because it's because that gets fairly subjective, and if you're a player that performs better than another player, but the guild leader or the raid leader is like, we're gonna take this guy, he's like more positive, or she is like more positive, or they're like more positive. You're like, well, that doesn't seem fair, right?
Well, does it? I mean, depending on what sort of person you are,
Well, yeah,
sure.
obviously there's a ton of like interpersonal issues at play, but the point is like, when you put a metric in front of a player, um, like for example, the game puts this problem in front of you, which is like you need to do X amount of damage in 16 minutes,
Uh huh.
right? When you put that in front of the player, you can't then be like, well, you shouldn't really care that much about doing the most damage possible, even though you have to do a certain threshold in 16 minutes.
So there's yeah. Well,
You
I
should care about
mean,
something
there's
else.
something to that, right? Like they're saying your metric should be did we clear or not versus that
Right,
whole
right. Well,
damage
that is
marathon.
their intention, right?
Yeah.
That's where the rewards are, for example. But I think if you think more about what that entails, that's not necessarily true. One of the aspects is like self improvement, the idea, right?
Uh-huh.
So I'll give a personal example. In Lost Ark, Valton is the first Legion raid, and I cleared it, but I kept dying because I kept messing up the mechanics. I wasn't happy. That didn't make me happy. I was actually very sad because I'm like, well, I cleared it, but now not only can I not do it anymore for the week because I got my rewards, I have to think about how I suck and I died, even though, and then I got carried, right? That's I don't think I'm wrong for feeling that. I mean, maybe I took it too far, but I don't think that's a like the game gives you that feedback,
Yeah, that I mean that makes sense.
right?
I guess what I'm getting at is I'm getting at the outside of the game stuff, the whole
Yeah.
the
Okay.
parsing and
Yeah.
and
That
basing your
stuff.
decisions on that more than all these other factors.
Yes. So you watched the Final Fantasy 14 drama video, right?
Yes.
That I we don't have time to get into today, but yeah, that stuff can and does get taken way too far by some groups, right? So, and that's what Ian is pointing at, right? But I feel like in this case, and by that I specifically mean like, okay, well, if you cleared and you hit a threshold that makes it clear that you will hit this damage check perfectly fine, getting 2% above that shouldn't matter,
Right.
right? And that I think that's fair and think that's reasonable, and that's kind of what if people ignored that basic fact, that's what guilds that have toxic environments or care way too much about parsing end up in, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. But this
And we'll
is
talk about that later. Yeah,
but it's a common thing though that people are
it is a common thing. Yes, probably too common, and it is a real problem. Yeah,
but it's like how do you even get rid of that? I mean like unless you
right.
disallow such tools, but it seems like
Well, even
that's
if you do
against a
disallow
lot.
such tools, you still can't really it. I mean, so obviously it will mitigate the problem, which is fine, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that like the source of the toxicity will go away.
Okay. Okay.
But maybe you can help mitigate it. So in a future episode, because we definitely don't have time, given that we're an hour in already. In a future episode, I do want to explore. Like what kind of things can you do as a game? How effective are they if you want to affect the way the community operates? Right?
Okay, like in
So for
uh-huh.
so for example, like League of Legends added this like in addition to report tool, you have this like commend tool or whatever, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, I remember that.
That's a kind of thing which is like, well, this is kind of stupid, but is it like, can you, how does this really affect something? Does it not? And of course, you can also do things in the core gameplay. Like if you disallow damage meters, then it's much harder, not impossible, but much harder to sort of judge people for their DPS, right?
The do they still have that commending system? Do you know?
I assume so. I don't know. I haven't
As I
looked at
recall, at
anything in
least
a long time.
internally, that it really did make some it did make a difference
I
in the
agree.
positive
I
direction.
think, yeah, I think people, well, not people. I think the internet, like Redditors and Twitterers,
Yeah,
really
non-humans.
underestimate the effect. Yeah, not humans, exactly. Really underestimate the effect that those small things can have because they're hard to see. So one example is YouTube removing the dislike button, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Good
This
move.
caused a big spat among the free speech people, right? But internally,
But it's like, what the fuck were those for anyway? Like, who
exactly.
you
Well,
go to
right.
a thing and you see it has I mean, maybe if it's like ratioed to the point like it's more downvotes than upvotes, but I can't even think of an example of that.
Well, there was the YouTube recap 2019 or whatever, most disliked video on YouTube history. But yeah,
This was their like PR, some PR announcement thing.
something like I think it was like I actually didn't watch it, but it was a big internet
Okay.
storm of some kind.
Okay.
Anyway, that's a tangent, but basically, I do think that those types of things, even if they seem stupid, do have a lot of effect, and we can think more about um, as a developer, we can think more about how to affect that, and we can also
Uh-huh.
affect that through game. I say we like I'm a developer. They can
We'll do
also
it.
affect that through gameplay. Um, if you change the targets on things, then you potentially could have such an effect. But that's beyond the scope of this episode, so we'll
Okay.
return to that
We'll
later.
talk about it
Um,
later.
the other thing, the actual issue I take with this answer is that that's not the situation where a good player is being benched is not the main problem. I think
Mm-hmm.
because that 5% damage loss is not. It's not only good players that get unlucky that suffer a 5% damage loss. Bad players that get unlucky also suffer that damage loss,
Yeah, it sounds like
right?
he's talking about two different things, right? Like they're both valid, but one doesn't eliminate the fact that there's a luck gap no matter
Right.
what skill you're at.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's just sort of saying that
Um,
the other factors make that negligible, and players and you are saying no, it's not negligible.
it's not negligible, right? And maybe negligible. Obviously, he says is. I think the quote he uses very funny, which is like the definition of competitive is up for debate or whatever. It's like, I mean, I guess, um,
Yeah.
you know, words like negligible and significant are obviously completely subjective, but what we can measure is that this people are, or maybe they're not, but the impression is that people are losing their ability to play the game because of bad luck, right? And there's nothing they can do
Yes.
about it. And by the way, some other games solve this problem by, well, if you get bad luck, you can just pay more money, but you
Yep.
can't even do that in this game, right?
I mean,
So
would people be happy about that though?
no, definitely not. But I think that's largely because of historical precedent and also like West, especially American culture and mentality towards the idea of paying money.
And or
Somehow it's like, yeah,
and adding it later, right? Like if you start your
right,
game with
right, yeah,
everything for sale, like it's less weird when you keep doing that as opposed to WoW. If you're like, oh, suddenly we're selling selling items for real
so
money.
in WoW, actually, people, when you people, there's this thing that happens where people emote spit on players they see with store mounts, like paid mounts,
Ah.
um, which which is like pretty funny, but
I like
also
that.
kind of points to the issue.
Uh-huh.
So for
I
so
want to
I
hear.
can say
I want you
that
to continue what you were saying about Americans versus
yeah.
Eastern
So
audiences. Also.
so one thing I noticed when I was in China is that there's much less of a stigma because there is for some reason, and I had it too, and I didn't really think about it till I got there, that there's a very strong stigma against like paying money at all to play a game, especially like a free to play or a gacha game. Like
Paying
there's
at
this,
all, not just for
yeah,
power.
yeah, exactly, or even more for paying for power, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But like there's the stigma against like, oh, you're a disgusting low skill player that pays money.
Uh-huh.
Um, and in fact, this applies to other things. Like there's like piracy culture is kind of more of a culture than a actual activity, right? Like
Ooh.
obviously, you most people you would think pirate just to have the thing, but
Uh-huh.
there's like a culture around it in the West where it's like we shouldn't pay money to watch a video because of
Sure. Right. Like
various
there's
whatever
something
justification,
there's
right?
some justification we have or some noble
Yeah.
there's a noble cause that we
Right.
can
Yes, there's like a
pretend this is.
nobility. Yeah, exactly. There's like a self-righteousness, which
Yeah, I mean,
confuses a
I
lot
have
of
that to some
society.
extent. Like I don't mind stealing from
Right.
companies that I don't like as much, but I don't think it's
Yeah.
like I don't think I'm noble for doing it or anything.
Right. Right.
I don't think it's like the
So
right thing to do
I
necessarily.
just think that there's like a core mentality difference that
Uh-huh.
makes so a lot of Asian MMOs, Lost Ark being one of them, are totally fine and don't have a problem with like a gotcha-ish or a microtransaction model.
Uh-huh.
Whereas in the West, that would be sacrilege and cause instant death for and like
Why do you
seven.
suppose
It
that
would
is?
cause so many. Huh?
Why do you suppose the different accounts for that difference? Like, why is did well? That doesn't make any sense either. I was going to say
Good
like
question.
gaming in China rose later than in the U.S., right? But
Yeah.
you, if that were the case, you'd think they would be the same in Japan, and that has been around longer. So, do you know about Japanese
Yeah.
players? If it's similar to
So, well, Final Fantasy 14, you cannot. I mean, there's like way bigger cash shop, and there's not really a stigma against it, but there, you still can't pay for power, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's two parts. The first part is like the idea of paying for power in the first place, is just has no precedent in Western MMOs or very little precedent, right?
Okay.
And because it has no precedent, then changing it to that, combined with the second part, which I think is like just there's some kind of mentality, cultural difference of self righteousness about this kind of thing. There's some, depending on your point of view, either hyper capitalist or hyper anti capitalist
Hmm.
belief about whether it's okay to steal. Obviously, to expand on that, like the hyper anti-capitalist is like, well, companies are all evil, so you can steal from them. The hyper-capitalist is like, well, it's a free market, and the free market if they want me to stop pirating things, they should arrest me, right?
Right. Right. Right.
I think both of
So
those are pretty
that's
strong. So
that's fun. Yeah, I guess yeah, Americans are especially encouraged to be individual individual
right, very
deciders of these things.
individualistic, right? I think that's a part of it where it's like it's not really results based. I think, or
Well, I
like
mean, I
success
get the
based.
idea. I mean, it certainly makes sense to say like, oh, well, this guy paid for power in whatever game I'm playing.
Right,
The competition isn't fair. Like, I get that.
right, right, right,
But when you get to spending money on anything like a cosmetic mount or
right,
whatever, that's funny. It's like, what does it matter?
right.
Because I remember when the what was it, Oblivion horse armor DLC came
The
out. That
very
was
first DLC, yeah.
the first cosmetic DLC, at least
Yep,
fully
yep,
cosmetic, and people were like,
yep.
why would anyone buy this? No, this is a complete. I don't understand. It doesn't do anything. They should just put it in the game for free. But of course,
Right.
cosmetic items are now huge now, and people are much more used to them and paying for them.
I guess that's also a part of it. This idea, I'll use the E word, entitlement, right?
Uh
This
huh.
idea that like there are things like some things are worth money, and if it's not within like these categories I decided, they should be free, right? Like
Yeah.
all these things should be provided to me for free,
I
which
mean,
is
it's
weird because
based on the
America is
past
such
too,
a
right? Like that's
yeah.
what things were like originally, right? In games.
I mean, maybe.
Or there was no avenue for you to do that. Even like
Right,
competitive
right,
games, it's
yeah,
not like you could pay the company to get
right.
a harder Mario hit or whatever.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. What was I talking about? Oh, I said, which that mentality is kind of weird because you would think that if you grow up in a capitalist environment, you have less entitlement than someone that grows up in a socialist environment, right? Or a more collective environment. But I think empirically that's quite opposite of the case.
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah, it is. I guess that's. I mean, there's also the whole American exceptionalism and the whole.
yeah,
If you work hard enough, you can. The American dream is what I'm looking for. The if you work hard
that's
enough,
fair.
anyone can become anything, and that's of course not true. But that is
That's a good
the
point.
that is the national like I don't know way of looking at life that every
Right.
politician repeats and repeats and repeats, and it's just not true.
I sure do love politicians.
Yeah, yeah, me too.
Okay, cool. Let's to get back on topic. So
Okay.
we will talk about like how a game can influence the community later. But for this specific case, I just want to. So I'm going to take the assumption that Ian like at least largely believes what he said and kind of like analyze the effects of if we actually listen to the actual words. Now, like you said, this seems very likely to be a spin job, which is fine. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, you have to consider what he's getting, the internal talk, and where, like to your point, like where did the idea for legendaries come from? What were they really
right,
trying to do? Because
right.
not knowing the total context, I'm speaking out
Mm-hmm.
of pocket here, but it sure seems like higher ups at Blizzard saw a genre defining gameplay element, which is rarities and legendaries and this sort of things in Diablo, something that they feel like they pioneered, and were like, how can we get this Blizzard pioneered thing into our other big flagship titles? Because in Diablo, it's like what everyone's excited about, why
Right.
everyone is continuing to play after the end game, right? Or during the end game.
Right. Yeah. And they actually did this with multiple Diablo mechanics. So Legendary
Yeah,
is one of them.
yeah,
Like World Quests are another one. If you played Diablo 3, right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. So in Diablo 3, you like go after the game, after you clear a zone, right? You can go back to the zone. There's all these exclamation points on the map, and you go there and you like, do a small quest, right? Rescue 10 villagers or like kill 5 rats. So they ported that directly into WoW, which I actually really enjoyed. They got obviously it gets kind of boring once you start having to grind them,
Yeah.
but functionally they were quite fun because they put you in the world. Anyway, yeah. So we'll talk about like the first thing we'll talk about is the purpose legendaries. The second thing I do want to talk about at the end is like he says, you'll be more successful if you take a essentially more results oriented approach. In other words, like if you clear, then you don't have to worry too much. Like if you can clear, you don't have to worry too much about it, which is fair. But I think that gets into a bit of a larger discussion about like how exactly players don't necessarily measure success by whether or not they got the rewards that you put in front of them, right? That's part of it, but that's definitely not the whole part. And the same thing for fun. So one example that I gave already is speedrunners. Speedrunners don't care that they beat the game. They don't think they succeeded when they see the title, the credits, right?
Right.
The success for them is something different. The same thing is for like achievement hunters, right? Achievement hunters have a different goal than people playing the game. And this is something I hate, by the way, this idea that like as the devs intended.
You hate that? Why?
The idea of like, if you're doing something not as the devs intended, you are doing it wrong, and you should not value what you value.
Yes.
Right. So same thing for achievement. Well, for achievement hunting, it is as the devs intended because they made the achievements, I guess. Right. But
Yeah, yeah,
Same
as the
thing with
devs
like
intended. Yeah,
collectibles.
I totally agree with you. I'm the sort of player that this is a little tangent again, but in movie style games, or actually not even that, like yeah, narrative style games,
Hmm.
I will try. I'm the sort of player that will try to go through the experience as the developer intended, like as
Right.
much as
Hmm.
possible. So if there is indicators telling me to run this way, I'm not the kind of player that's going to say, well, what happens if I run this way? But a
Right.
lot of players are. There are a lot of people like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's just no point in saying that like one is right and wrong. I mean, so you can say it's not like you can't say anything about it, right? You can say things like, "Well, I think you'll have more fun if you do it this way,"
Mm-hmm.
right? But that's again, that's individual. That's not something that without knowing the person you can make any kind of statement for, in my opinion, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
If you're playing the game your way, like why should we
right.
stop that?
And so this, I guess it could be a whole other episode, but one of the things that comes up is like cheating in single player games, right?
Oh yeah.
Um, People are
Hey,
like,
that's
well,
like
why are
reminds
you
me of easy
cheating?
mode too, you know?
Yeah, yeah, easy mode too, right? It's like, well, why are you cheating in a single player? Well, it's like, I don't, maybe they shouldn't be cheating. They'll have more fun if they don't cheat. That's totally reasonable. But maybe they have a different goal in mind. They want to see something. They don't want to deal with it. They just want to be super powerful for a day.
Yeah.
They want to laugh at how strong they are or whatever.
Yeah, or they have like 1 hour a week to play or whatever, and they
Right,
just are like, I don't have
right,
time to do all this shit, so I'm gonna skip to the
right.
good part.
Um, so at the same time, they're one of the way. So the problem is you can't do that when you're cheating in a multiplayer game
Right.
because that has effects on other people, right? And that's kind of where this in an MMO we get into that territory because your values now affect other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at its core, I don't think players that want the biggest DPS number possible just because they want it are any way inferior than a player that tries to collect all the achievements just to have it. Right? I think it's
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally basically the same thing.
Yeah.
And if you allow, like, you put in a system that rewards players for doing more damage, then you you have to expect that players are going to want to do more damage, right? That's
Yep.
even if they take it to the extreme. That's kind of just how people work.
I mean, you can try to before and during the launch of a feature to position it in a way that gets people
Yeah,
coming in to play it a certain way.
yeah,
But, you know, a year or so down the line, they're going to play it the way they play it. And
right,
you got to deal with that. You can't like talk them out of it.
right. And I think that's a good point actually. So I guess there's two ways you can affect kind of like the way people interact, right? One is like the way you position it and the way you tell people to do it, basically, and you try
Uh-huh.
to guide people to do it. And the other is the actual empirical um, evidence, basically,
Yeah.
of,
Yeah.
well, this is what people do because, and there's usually a because, right? It's usually because there's
Hmm.
some system in place that like rewards them for doing it this other way.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
there's, yeah, definitely.
and I think maybe one of those things is maybe you can change the system in a certain way to, for example, reduce the toxicity in finding a group, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Maybe that's for the future.
Okay.
So let's talk about the thing you've been hitting at, which is why did they make these things in the first place? I think you. I'm actually curious. So this guy Ian is the game director.
Uh-huh.
Do you think he made this? Is he a higher up, or did it come from above him?
I mean, I'm totally just speculating, but uh, he's a game director on an individual game
He- um,
on WoW, and not all multiple
let's
games.
see. WoW
Probably.
Legion, probably, yeah.
Yeah. It would be
I
like a
know he was.
VP. It would probably be like a VP or CE of design that is overseeing all of the portfolio.
Okay,
That feels
that's
like a cross portfolio thing to me, like something an
right.
executive or someone who's thinking about the how all the games fit together. But honestly, it could be the other. It could just be him. But it's at that sort of level. Certainly, it would be. the director of the game thinking, oh, well, there's this system that we could use. I just don't know. I don't
Right.
know which direction
And
it
kind of
came
lead
from.
into it. Yeah. Obviously, none of us will probably ever know, right? But I am curious as to
I bet I could find out,
what it
but
sounds
I don't know if
like. Oh,
would be allowed to say it.
unfortunate.
Yeah.
Maybe you can just roll it into the lawsuit somehow and make it,
Yeah, okay.
make it public information by necessity.
I'll just pretend I'm talking about another game.
Right, right. So I'll give some examples. So what exactly are these legendaries? We've talked about a couple before. I'll just highlight a couple so we have a better idea of what we're looking at.
Uh-huh.
The example I'll use is for Havoc Demon Hunter. Like I said, this is the class I played the most during this time. So
Havoc is like a
I know,
specific spec of Demon Hunter, is that?
yeah,
Okay.
it's the DPS spec,
Okay.
and Vengeance is the tank spec.
Gotcha.
So Havoc, we already talked about one. I know the best in slot in most cases for Havoc was Delusions of Grandeur, which is the one that reduces your Metamorphosis cooldown, and Anger of the Half Giants, which just says Demon's Bite generates an additional 1 to 14 Fury, Demon Blaze generates an additional 1 to 6 Fury. Basically, this is just a passive that increases your Fury gain. So if you combine these two, you can imagine that one increases your Fury gain, one reduces your cooldown for every 30 Fury you spend. It's not hard to understand why.
So it's accelerating another resource for
Right.
those guys? Okay.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But some other examples. So this is where as I looked through the examples, I thought it was weird that he said, well, we're just going to make them all situationally viable. Because Moarg's Bionic Stabilizers, like we said, says Throwgrave deals 25% additional damage for each enemy hit. Similarly, Lorimus the Lipides Sacrifice says Fell Rush deals 10% increased damage for each target hit. These are basically the same effect, right?
Yeah.
Like they do more damage in AoE situations, but they're not even competitive in AoE situations, for example, right? Another example is Chaos Theory, which is Blade Dance has a 10% chance to grant you Chaos Blades for 6 seconds, which is a buff to you. This is another one where it's like, this is not situational, right? Because Blade Dance is a skill you use whenever it's off cooldown.
Yeah, and 10% chance. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, 10% chance, whatever, but it doesn't necessarily change the way you play. And
No.
this is something that's not situational at all, right? Because you just use Blade Dance every time it's off cooldown anyway.
So like specific raids or
right.
Blade Dance raids.
Yeah. Maybe they intended it that way, but it
it does seem
need to do a
sort of
better
like
job,
they're speaking
right?
out of both. Like it doesn't seem to make sense quite what he's saying.
Right.
Doesn't
Right.
seem to match what the goals appear to be.
Right. So if your goal is to make things situation viable, then they should apply to certain situations, right? And it's pretty clear looking at this list that the vast majority of them are just passives that apply to every situation.
So they may have changed 4 years in or whatever, 3 years in.
They may have. So these might be
might have been
different.
like, all right,
so
now
it
we
was
gotta
actually
make
pretty
it
hard.
these.
Yeah, I guess I should say this because it's actually pretty hard to find because the game is still active and it's been patched. It's hard to find information from back then. I think these are from back then because this is a guide that was written in 2018 or whatever that I pulled these from. So I'm pretty sure these are still relevant, but I could be wrong. Certainly can't remember. And then there's like purely defensive ones. It says Vengeful Retreat heals you for 25% maximum health and grants you 20% lead for 8 seconds. Obviously, if you're maximizing damage, except in specific situations, you don't use this. Right? That's fine.
But that one's specific then, right? Specific types of situations.
Right. So I think you could use this if you're taking a lot of damage, but so here's the thing about the triangle is that because the healers exist, no one has to care about taking damage. Except unless
right,
they
like
kill
you shouldn't make any of your options if you're not a healer.
Right.
Healing.
Like because the healer is there to heal you, if you don't die, you should prioritize doing damage over not getting hit in some situations. Obviously,
yeah, I see.
Healers get mad at you, right? But defensive options basically become less important because you're trying to optimize damage.
And leech is health leech.
Yeah, it's like lifesteal, I think.
Yeah, lifesteal. Okay.
I think. Yeah.
So it's more.
Anyway,
healing.
these are just some examples. So these are so the first thing is, well, that's where they're definitely not situationally applicable. The second thing is, like I already mentioned, if they wanted to make them all about the same, because they're mostly passives, I think that wouldn't have been too hard either. Maybe they did do that later, and maybe they were close enough. But for example, it's very hard because the best in slot options, one gives you Fury gain and one gives you a bonus for the Fury you spend, right? Because there's a synergy there. Even if they all individually perform the same, you still have a best in slot 2 set, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right. That's a problem. But my theory, and this is based on a little bit of what I heard like second and third hand about what they said, was like you said, they want to port this cool mechanic from Diablo. And why did they want to do this? Because they wanted you to get the feeling that you got something really cool and unique and different. And you could get it from just playing the game, right? Now, the thing is, for me, since I didn't play competitively, I just did world stuff, open world stuff, and walked around and did quests. That actually worked pretty well because I didn't really care if I got the best one or not because I didn't need to pass any damage checks.
Yeah.
Right? And things that were defensive were useful because
you're on your own.
You're on your own. So that worked pretty well in that situation. But and I think there's a problem though, because I think if that was your only goal, you could have just left it out of the end game or whatever, right? Like you could just make it a casual only situation.
Oh, sure. If you wanted it, yes. If you wanted it for single player.
Right. Yeah. Where it worked quite well, right? And maybe that's where a lot of the design went into, because again, you could get it through, like it was not any easier to get through hard content than easy content, right? Than single player content.
Yeah, and this makes a certain amount. I mean, there is PvP in Diablo, right? But it's not really the focus ever.
Yeah, not really.
So, yeah, they basically ported a system over to a new problem, a new,
right,
which is big group activities,
right,
and everyone judging you based on what you have,
right, which certainly is that ended up basically being the problem, right? But yeah, I think they worked quite well in single player. I think they tried to recapture this idea of like getting a cool drop, and but they wanted to keep it going all the way to the 5th year of the game, right? It's like even in the maybe not the 5th year, even after a year of playing the game, you can still get this feeling of, oh, finally I got this cool new thing that I didn't have before. Without, and they want to do this without, because they can do that, but through the gear treadmill. But again, the treadmill ends up being a bit like a treadmill, right? You kind of expect it because there's no big moment, right?
Yeah, there's no surprises.
Right. A treadmill, you're just going at a steady rate, which is what people want, which is why they complain about this. But if you didn't want that, this is a way to do that, right? Like you want to keep having a big moment sometime into the end game.
I mean, that seems like a good goal.
I think that is a good goal. Yeah, I agree. Because one of the things is in end game MMOs, you get on this treadmill, right? And when you're on a treadmill, everything is kind of a blur, right? All your improvements are pretty small and marginal.
Exactly. Your progression is marginal. It's always like just a tiny little bit, and if it doesn't feel big enough, I'm gonna quit eventually.
Right. Or you'll get addicted to the
with.
treadmill and you keep going, right? Or that. But you do get this through like the leveling experience, for example, right? When you get to a new expansion where you get a level, you get a whole new skill, and maybe that feels much bigger than before, right?
For sure.
So I think that's fair. So I think for a casual player, I think they actually did kind of capture this idea. One of the other things in Diablo is you get this idea of experimentation, right? So you get a legendary, and it's like, because in Diablo you have a set number of, you have a limited number of skill slots, right? You have like 20 skills or whatever, but you can only use 5 of them, I think, or 8 of them. I can't remember either. But so it's like, oh, well, I got this item, as I'm leveling that increases the skill I don't use. So let me just experiment with it, right? Let me just
Right,
put it
right.
on with this legendary and try it out. And that's, I think most people think that's quite fun, right?
Uh-huh.
But I don't, in this case, I'm not sure they succeeded in that because these are mostly passives, right? Maybe it's a demon
Because
hunter thing. Maybe
they
other
don't
classes
ask you to
had,
change much or
yeah.
anything.
It doesn't really. Most of them don't really change how you play, which is fine. Um,
But it's interesting
but
because some
this,
do, like some do and some don't. So
yeah, some do and some
it's
don't, right? So it
mixed.
depends
Yeah.
on what you get. Yeah, you get one, you just put it on, or you get another one, you have to think about a little bit more.
Yeah.
Um, so I do think the first one kind of worked for casual players. I don't think experimentation necessarily worked very for casual players. The problem is when you try to scale this all to the end game for the hardcore players or the grinders, as they say,
Mm-hmm.
you can see the problem, right? Just like in Diablo, you can once you've experimented enough, you reach the point where it stops being like it's only interesting the first time, right? Like once
Mm-hmm.
you figure it out, you kind of know what it is. You don't need to play around with it anymore unless like something changes, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So just like in Diablo, you can at very early on a player that wants to optimize a quote unquote min maxer, a min max mentality haver.
Mm-hmm.
They will just look at the list and be like, oh, what's the best one? I'm
Yeah.
what is theoretically the best one? I want this one. I don't think that's.
Yeah,
I
min
think that
maxers are
for
about the numbers more than the feel of whatever they like.
right,
The fun,
right.
I guess you could say. That's fun for
Well,
them.
right,
The min
right.
maxing.
I think that is a key point. But yeah, that and we will talk about the idea of like this, like why can't you just let people do things based on the vibes?
Yeah.
Some people don't want to do that. But yeah, min maxers will look at the list, and this is true.
I'm a,
So, for example, in a digital card game, it's the same, right? Like some players want to go in blind when a new set of cards comes out,
uh-huh.
and be like, "Oh, this is cool. This is cool. Let me read this. Let me read that." And some players uh, want to just look at the list of all the new cards, right,
Yeah.
before
Come in
they touch
prepared.
them, and be like, "Oh, okay, like this looks cool. That looks cool. I want this one. I want that one,"
Uh-huh.
and then they don't really care about this like
Yeah, some
joy of
people want the
discovery.
surprise of discovery
Right.
as a part of this. Yeah, okay.
And you can argue that like maybe more people should value the joy of discovery. But again,
Yeah.
yeah, when
I mean,
when
when
you
you're
start
arguing,
telling
should
people what,
people how to have fun?
yeah,
It's not. You're not
yeah,
really. Yeah.
I feel like that's a losing argument and a total waste of time, no matter what. So
Yeah, I think so.
um, okay, so I think given this situation, you have to think about what it caused people to do, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so it seems like the intention. So what was the intention from a long-term gameplay perspective, right? Um, it seems like because of the variety and because of what they said, it seems like the idea is to give you more options, right? Because if you boil it down, what happened was that there were two that were good, or like there was a set that was good, and then there was a bunch of trash.
Uh-huh.
And for the same very rare outcome, you could either get something that was good or trash. So if you take a very cynical approach, what that means is they just wanted to spread the amount of time you played longer by giving you a chance to win the lottery, but also putting in a bunch of trash that they knew was trash so that you have to keep playing to try to win the lottery next time,
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
right?
So there's differing value in what the lottery will give you. Yeah.
Right. But what they said is that, oh, no, there should be no trash. It should all be the same. But that's clearly not true.
Huh.
And I'm not sure that they took steps to prove that that's what they wanted. But
Well,
the end result, yeah.
and the fact that they didn't phase legendaries out ever
They did in
makes
the
me.
next expansion, I
Oh,
think.
oh, they did. I thought you said
Wait,
they're
did
around
they?
today.
Um, did they phase legendaries out in? BFA. I don't remember, but they changed a lot. Like they no longer worked this way.
Okay.
I know that this was a Legion specific thing. Now BFA was maybe even worse in some ways, but um, yeah, this sort of idea of like making a because okay, well if you think about it a different way, these are basically talents, right? Like if you think about um, WoW talents or like League of Legends. I guess I don't know what League of Legends talents are like now. They're stronger than that, but they're basically talents that like change how a certain skill works, right?
Yep.
It's like so basically at the end of the day, all it is it's a talent stapled to a piece of equipment that's a very rare drop, and they continue to maintain this idea. But maybe they did. I think they did it in a less RNG dependent fashion. They just maybe moved it back to normal talents, more or less.
Yeah. Yeah. League of Legends had runes and masteries that I think they turned into
Yeah.
something.
Oh, masteries. Yeah.
Masteries is just talents, but I think they turned it into something that had more of a gameplay effect. Like they leaned into that more. So
Right. I think that's true.
Yeah.
I've been hanging out.
So
with
there's real
Zoomies that play
choices.
League
I
of
mean,
Legends
it makes
recently.
sense.
Yeah. But yeah, the most cynical view is that they put these in here as a gambling mechanic to keep people engaged in the game, which combined with some of the other stuff they did is not an unreasonable assessment, right?
I think that's certainly possible. Like what other stuff?
Yeah. Like one of the things is, and they leaned into this even harder in BFA, is that they added infinite scaling in this patch, right? So they used Diablo 3's Paragon level system, more or less. So the more you played,
just tiny marginal increases as you play any of your characters, right? Like it's okay. Yeah. It's shared across all of them.
No, it's not shared across all of them. This one isn't, which
not in
which
WoW.
was a big problem. Yeah, not in WoW, but in Diablo it is. But yeah, as you kept playing, you got a tiny number kept going up the more time you put in.
Yeah, I mean, I like to see numbers going up.
We should talk about numbers going up games.
I mean that's a whole discussion. I was I told you I just like a weekend ago I was in the Fresno area playing board games with people, and a lot of the people there are game designers, and I'm the only marketing person there, and they play a lot of very numbers heavy games, strategy games where you have to think many turns ahead, and you have to have the numbers in your head, and you have to think about what the other player's numbers are. And then there's other types of games like there's games that are more like word games or they kind of call them party games a lot of the time, like your taboos, your Pictionaries, the stuff where there's no numbers really other than the score. And I'm always the guy there I'm one of the guys there that's always trying to push playing some of the word games, because most of those guys get so much, their brains are basically built around that kind of numbers heavy strategy, and I'm not.
I actually don't. So that's very interesting. Also, please introduce me to some of your game designer friends at some point. But so I don't actually know too much about board games, but I only have this impression that they get like increasingly more complex as you play more of them. Like I only have experience with like basic. I've actually been pretty into chess recently, but I only have experience with like Catan and like other like Munchkin, other like quote unquote basic entry level.
They get very, at least to me, they get very complex. Very complex, but they don't always. It's not just about adding complexity. I mean, they do. There are games in like the worker replacement genre that are very similar, but somehow manage to make the decisions you make more interesting.
Oh man, we should talk. This gets my juices flowing because I've been thinking a lot. So I've been watching some City Skylines videos. And one of the things I've noticed, I've been watching like former actual civil engineer do some challenges City Skylines, right?
Okay, that's
and it's really gotten my idea, because like for a long time I've had this idea about how it would be cool to make a hyper realistic game, right? But as we kind of discussed in the last episode too, like a lot of times realism, like you need the more realistic you get, or like how do I put this, there's like a limit, there's like a threshold to realism where up to that threshold is cool, and as soon as you cross that threshold it's really really annoying.
Yeah, just realism as a goal by itself isn't a game.
Right. Right, exactly.
And
But
in fact, many
there's
things
like
about games are avoiding what reality is.
yeah, exactly. But it's
pumping it
like
up.
kind of interesting to look at City Skylines and see like how there's like specific annoying things about realism that they ignore. That's great. So for example, one is like time, like how long it takes for something to build.
Yep.
Right. Obviously that's not realistic, but the game, but a lot of other things are realistic. Like traffic is annoying and it's realistic, and water physics or whatever. But
Do
and
you have
like
to build
height
sewers
of
still?
buildings. Yes, but
Yeah.
but you don't have to actually. That's another thing. Like building pipes does not take a bunch of time. It takes money. The money part is like maybe sort of realistic,
But you
but
don't have to
there's
like manually
specific.
connect them through the city. Hopefully.
Well, you do, but you can do that
Okay.
just by drawing a line.
I see. Yes, yes, yes.
Basically, the idea is like there's like specific things that get taken out that are like super annoying, and everything else is like fun annoying. So, well, for some people, I actually don't like that game that much, but
Sure, but it's part of the fun is doing
Right.
those details for them.
right, right. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah, put it on the list. But yeah, let's go back to where we
am I?
were.
Oh, okay. I forget exactly what we're talking about, but I wanted to break down. The legendaries are, because they are, you're asking players to make a finite choice, right? There's like 12 or 20 options or whatever. You can only pick two of them. You are asking the players to make a choice, right? And you put in system, by you I mean the game designer or developer in this case, right? You have to put in a system that guides them along that path. Or they'll do it themselves. So for example, performance based is one of the options where they do it themselves, right? Like you put a challenge in front of them, and the challenge has certain parameters. One is damage, or one is not dying to mechanics. And it's up to the player to decide what choice fits that specific performance, right? And they will pick, if you do that, they will pick the most performative choice, probably, assuming the community makes reasonable decisions, which they don't always do, right?
Sure.
So, and Ian pointed to two options. One is if the situation, he gave the specific example of like, well, the situation should dictate what you pick, which is not true, but we can think about what would happen if that was leaned into more. And then the other one was like, well, if they're all the same, then you should pick based on preference, right? So if all of them performed exactly the same, then you have a perfect world where you can just pick on vibes.
Yep.
Right. But that doesn't fit perfectly into the situation later. So we'll talk about it. So I want to break down these three. Well, there's actually 5 options, but the three main options that apply here are situation-based, performance-based, or preference-based, or as the kids say, vibes-based. Right. Well, I guess no, vibes is now old people, because like I listen to like a football podcast and like they say vibes. So vibes is graduated.
Oh, is it the kids? We don't want to say
Yeah.
that. Okay.
Yeah. No, we can say that now. We can't say the things the kids actually say, but we can say vibes.
Oh, okay. Vibes based.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm very
okay.
vibes based in games.
You do live in Colorado, so that's.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
did I just
buddy.
dox you? Well, I guess it doesn't.
No. I don't think they'll find me.
I guess it's
in
probably
Colorado.
fine.
It's fine.
Colorado's pretty big.
Yeah.
Probably.
Try to find me. That's my challenge to you, the listener.
Okay, so there's two. Aside from these two, there's 2 other options. The first one is force. Like you said, movie games mostly fall into this category. These don't apply to MMOs, but any game where you don't really have a choice, you just do what's in front of you, basically points you in a direction by force, right?
Right. Yes.
If there's a wall in your way, if there's a one path and there's a wall in your way, you have to go that way, unless you can clip out of bounds, right? But another example is like puzzle games are pretty linear. Like there's a puzzle, Like if you imagine like a sliding block puzzle game,
Uh-huh.
what are you gonna do? Clip out of bounds? Like you
Yeah.
either play the puzzle as it's
Smash the
intended, or
sliders. Yeah.
yeah, you either play the puzzle as intended or you don't play the game. Right?
Right, right.
That's not applicable here. The other one is high a limitation based system. In other words, use what you have because you can't have everything. So it sounds like this was basically the outcome, which doesn't seem like it's what they intended. But this is the system that exists when you have essentially a gotcha system, a high variance collection system, right?
Yes, a gadget system is there's so many rare items or
Yes,
characters, you're only going to get some no matter what. You're limited.
unless you pay a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
But for the vast majority of players, the point of the game is that you can't have everything,
Uh-huh.
right? Because like you said, because there's a high variance system. In other words, there's a bunch of rare stuff that's hard to get, which is the case here, and it's a collection system where there's a lot of rare stuff, right? Those two things combined means you have a system where you can't have everything. You have some of the rare stuff, and it's different than what other people have. This is fun, allegedly.
Allegedly. So how compatible is that with a game like WoW?
Well, this is what happened, right? Again, I don't really have the numbers, but if we believe the question, or at least the perception, was that this is what happened. You have a situation where some people had, everyone had some subset of the legendaries that were different from others, and the people that did not have the right subset did worse than the people who had the right subset.
Yep. Right.
And in WoW, that caused the problem that we started the game with, right?
Why does that
Or that we
why
started
does
the
that
podcast.
show up in an MMO versus like does this happen in like Destiny, for example? Like when you pick up your ultra rare loot, you're probably doing a little more damage or whatever. So I wonder if they kick people out who don't have good. Anyway, I don't know.
I don't know anything about Destiny, but I can speak from Lost Ark because Lost Ark is a Korean MMO, and that means it has microtransactions.
Woo.
And it does not shy away from the idea of you can pay money to be stronger, right? So there's a lot of players that are way stronger than other players, right? And there's not an expectation like there is in WoW, I think, right? That there is such a thing as like peak power, and everyone can attain peak power, right? In Lost Ark,
They just keep getting better.
you can just there is literally a peak, and some players in Korea have reached it, and I'm sure some on NA have, but that costs a lot of money. Like actually like tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Nice. Nice.
That people have spent.
Well spent.
Yeah, money well spent, of course. Now I'm the American that's judging.
Yeah, so judgy. I spent $10,000 on Lost Ark.
But the thing is, so the reason it's a problem in WoW is because I think in this specific case because it breaks the expectation. There was some kind of established expectation that your power should scale with a reasonable amount of time. That was way less than what it ended up being, and your skill, right? And now, whereas in other games, there is no such expectation because it is expected that your power can also scale with money that you pay. But because you can't do that in WoW, now the problem, I think, arises from the fact that it doesn't scale with money, and it sort of scales with time, but not a reasonable amount of time. Instead, it scales with luck.
Yep.
And I think that's where the problem came in, right? It feels bad to not be able to do as well as someone you think you're better than because you got unlucky.
So there's two things though. Is the problem that what you just said, that it feels bad from that gap?
I think so.
Or how much of it is driven from the group nature? Like I'm getting judged, right? I'm getting cooked. Not the whole community, like whatever groups I'm in to play the game. Am I going to get kicked out feeling like, they know I don't have this. I feel bad. I feel worried.
Right. Probably both. But I guess that is exactly what Ian basically pointed to, right? Like you should not, just because you are 2% lower than you should be does not mean they should kick you, assuming that you're a good person to be around, right?
Right. But we have no idea how true that is.
Right. And one example I wanted to give is like that 2% affects the good players that are at the top that are good to be around, but it also affects the people at the bottom who are not that good to be around, but can make it. But now they're 2% less, and they're way more angry about it than normally, and they become less fun to be around, and they get kicked. And right. Or a player that's like, I have hardcore friends, and I'm not really hardcore, but I can barely make like the bottom threshold that we have as a group. Because like you do need a bottom threshold, right? That's kind of how Lost Ark works. It's like yes, you can be as strong as you want, and we don't really care that you are or are not like mega strong, but you do need to hit a baseline, otherwise we can't succeed. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
So this similarly affects the players who are not who are like more casual, who wants to raid with their more hardcore friends, who can barely hit the bottom threshold, and now they can't anymore. Right.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Like, I think, yes, the community could have done a better job handling this, but you gave them a system that caused this problem, right? And so part of the responsibility also falls on the system itself, right?
I'm curious.
Just
I want to
because
know how much, if at all, this is a problem in other games, like I said, Destiny or Diablo, right? Because don't you do raids with teams, right? Like, so people are...
I think Diablo doesn't really have endgame content, right? Only greater rifts. I don't know if...
Really?
Well, that was when I played.
But I played Destiny 1 and did the raids, and that had that. I mean, it did always seem... Maybe it was the fact that it's a shooter and more twitchy. It just seems like everything comes down a little bit more to your actual skill than the numbers, and maybe WoW is a little less twitchy.
Okay, that's a good point.
I guess you do a lot at once,
true.
though, in the end game.
No, it is true. So there's a couple things actually. So first is it's a culture thing for one, right? Which is like because like in Destiny, I imagine based on what you said, like there's a parsing, like the parsing culture is not as strong, right? Probably.
Well, I guess I don't know, because I played with friends who didn't do that, so it's hard.
Because that's right. That's the other thing. Like similarly in WoW, if you just want to be what they call a casual raider and just raid with your friends and do the easy mode, that's fine. And at the same time, the specific problem that applies only to a very specific subset of situations, which is like hard progression rating, competitive, right, at release. That is a small subset, very, very small subset of player base. I assume. Right. So if they just didn't care about it because it's too small, like I understand that as well.
Yeah, and my team, they didn't kick me out because of my legendaries. They kicked me out because of my attitude.
Right. I see. You got real toxic with it, huh?
Yeah, not really. I'm very positive.
What was I? Oh, and there's one more thing, which is in Final Fantasy and in Lost Ark, the raids are generally almost always 8 people. In WoW, there are 20 people, or more. I think you can go up to 40. Now that has some dynamics of its own, but one of the differences, I think one of the things that this caused is that there's a much stronger ability to play with randoms successfully in Final Fantasy and Lost Ark than there is in WoW, because instead of having to coordinate 20 people, you can coordinate with 8 people, and that seems much easier to manage when you have random people that are not communicating as much.
Yes, yeah, of course. Okay, for sure.
So because you can do that with random people, and because if you're doing it with random people, you're getting judged less, probably. At least if you're getting judged, they usually don't talk to you because you're not in the call in the server with them, right?
Yep.
That can mitigate the situation as well. But I don't know. I would not be. In fact, I'm actually quite sure that this problem is very small and way overblown by the community. But that doesn't mean. But I think it's still a problem, and I think specifically their response to it was weird.
It was weird, yeah. It
and
was not a uh, yeah, it was not a very clear and meaningful response.
right. And I'm sure that other responses too, but basically, it was weird enough that I wanted to kind of examine what their intentions were in the first place.
Hmm. Yeah, I
What
mean,
are we talking about? Okay,
it was essentially denying the question, so that
right, right. Which I guess is,
it's like, oh,
we
so this
have
is a
a
problem we have, and I'm like, oh no, you don't have that problem. You're just thinking about it wrong.
you're getting gaslit.
Yeah,
Gaslighting is all the that's another vernacular.
yeah. The kids probably have a new word for it now.
Yeah. Um, we have a evils of marketing episode planned. Gaslighting the audience is
Oh yeah,
number one, I
I do want to
suppose.
talk about that. I mean, it's marketing is basically just psychology with a different application.
One might argue a
An
terrible
evil
application,
one.
but an evil, yes. Have you ever considered being a voice actor? You got quite a
Yeah, I
range
would love
there.
to be, but yeah, I don't know how to get in.
Um, you and me both, except not with voice acting for me. Well, we have this podcast now. This is your portfolio.
All right,
You
yeah,
just got to
I'll
do a different,
every episode I'll
play
be
a
a new
different
character.
character. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There you go. Do this one as Dante from the Devil May Cry series. Just kidding. Don't
I'll
do
do
that.
some research on
That
him.
sounds pretty hard. Okay, so the two that were not. So one is you make a player. So we were talking about how you point a player in directions with your system, which is applicable here, right? One is by force, which doesn't apply, and one is just by hardcore variance limitation, which is what
Hmm.
happened here, more or less, which is not what they intended. It sounds like, at least that's not what they say they intend,
Hmm.
right? Um, there's now let's explore the ones that they talked about. One is situation based, right?
Hmm.
Which is what Ian referenced, which is the idea that, well, you should make a choice based on what the situation dictates to you.
Yep.
So, for example, our example was Sefu's. You use it when you can dispel or interrupt or stun and add or whatever, right?
Right.
Cool. That's great. What if you? But I think, well, first of all, he seemed to indicate that he wants to do it all the way, which they didn't. And I think if you do it all the way, you're into some problems. So obviously, I think some situation-based things need, or like there's just not enough space if you don't have any situation-based things, then I think they lead to interesting gameplay. But if everything is situation-based, you end up with basically a linear one-to-one mapping that takes away what you intend to be a creative process, right? Like I think what you envision when you define this kind of situation-based process is like, a player is like, oh, I walk into this room with this problem, and I'm like, I can reach into my toolbox and pull out, what's a tool that normal people have that can solve problems?
Green fur.
Uh, yeah, I pull out green fur.
Okay.
I pull out a hook shot. I guess that's a good example, actually, right?
Uh-huh.
Because Zelda does this. Like you walk in a dungeon, it's like, oh, there's this problem in front of me. I can reach into my bag and pull out my hook shot, and this solves the problem. Cool.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Um,
they're all about that.
right. Or I can pull out my bow and I can solve this problem. That's cool, but if you lean all the way into this in an MMO setting, I think it just leads to a one-to-one mapping, where you don't have the creativity at all. I mean, you have the joy of discovery the first
Hmm.
time, and then after that, because again, it's an MMO, it's meant to be replayed, right? After that, you're just like, oh, well, in this fight, I have to prepare this, and then the next fight, I prepare that, and so on, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then when you see a similar problem, you're like, oh, well, this is type X, and on type X, I bring Y,
Hmm.
and that's it, right? I think it very quickly loses this luster of like creativity and openness, and it just becomes sort of like micromanaging, right? Like
I see. So
I
that
have to,
you're saying that it doesn't actually add a super like interesting choice. It
right.
adds
In fact, it adds no
you
choice
can
at
now
all.
check a box on this particular
Yeah,
raid or whatever.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's like checking, it's like box checking, right? In
Yeah.
fact, whereas you might imagine it gives you more choice, in fact, it gives you no choice at all, right? Because if one option is clearly necessary, then that's the only option,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Okay.
Why is so that's a problem. Obviously, you can sort of separate it into. So one paradigm is like, okay, well, there's a sustained option which is always active, and there's like a quote unquote burst option which is like situational, right? You like wait for the right situation, and then you do your thing, you do your magic thing, and then you're really strong, and then you go back. So if you have both things exist, so if you have a passive and you have Sefus, then the burst option has to be better than the sustain option, right? Otherwise, there's no point. Otherwise, why would you go through the extra effort of making something work when you can just have a passive? Right?
Yep.
And therefore, that leads to over centralizing. If you go all the way in,
couldn't there be enough legendaries that even if there are situational things, there are like 2 or 3 choices for those each situation?
Yeah,
based
maybe.
on what you have. I guess that adds another level of just extra stuff.
Yeah. So that obviously that depends a lot on the design and the system you have in place, right? So I'll give you a very simple example. Sefus gives you haste, right? So a very, very way too simple example of what you just described is like, okay, well, Sefus gives you haste when you interrupt. So what if you have the same effect, but it gives you a different stat? So you have 3 different ones, and one gives you crit, and one gives you flat damage or whatever. That obviously is, but see, when you have a number attached to it instead of an effect, then you have, and this is true if you have an effect too, but essentially what you end up doing is like, well, one of them has to be the best.
Right? Yeah, okay, I see.
Right? Either they're all the same or one of them has to be the best. And then again, you add one more layer to it, one more layer of Yomi, right? But very, I guess that's sort of...
One more layer of what?
That's a fighting game thing, I think.
Yomi?
In fact, I'm not just right. Yomi, yeah.
What's
I think Yomi is like the guessing. It's like adding a layer of Yomi based on my very plebeian understanding is like when you do a mix-up, now your opponent has to think about that new mix-up you did. So you can do the normal thing, and then you can add a layer of Yomi, which is like you can do a different thing, and then you can do another different thing in the same situation. Now they have to think more about what your possibilities are.
Is that a Japanese word? Yomi?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I don't know what it means.
Anyway, sorry. You were talking about over-centralizing.
Yeah. So I think what it kind of boils down to is if you do things, if you add one layer at a time, well, you get something to think about the first time, but again, you're in a situation where you're meant to play the same thing 10, 100, 200 times, right? And so that one extra layer of complexity gets lost very quickly.
Because you're doing the same thing again and again, and they don't...
So
those don't vary.
So the first time you're like, oh, I need to bring a interrupt effect. And the second time it's like, oh, well, there's actually 3 interrupt effects. That's cool. Which one is best for me? Oh, it's this one. And then, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of being a one-to-one mapping about what's best.
Yep.
Right. Obviously, there's a lot more you can do with it, but that's a very simple example of that.
Okay.
I think the biggest problem in this context, though, is that it actually makes the problem of needing a specific drop worse, if you think about it. Because now, instead of like, well, I have this thing that does 7% damage, and this thing that does 5% damage, and I don't have the 7% one, but I have the 5% one, so it's good enough. Now, you're like, well, in this fight, you have this thing that does 37% damage, and then you have your normal thing that's 7% damage. And if you don't have the 37% one, well, we can't take you, obviously, because that's a huge gap.
Yeah.
Right? Because if one has to perform way better than everything else, then like, well, now you need all of them, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just needing one in particular, now you need all of them.
Yeah, or else you have to build your character around them or something.
Right.
Which by that time you're not doing, I guess.
And this, I think, if you think about things that are situation based, I think some good examples from other games come up, which is So one thing is in Magic, there's a sideboard. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there's two. The sideboard is where you put your quote-unquote hate cards, as they're called. These are super targeted cards that are in your sideboard because they don't work against every deck, but they target one specific thing very linearly and very well.
Just so I understand, sideboard is between matches you can swap
Yes.
in cards into your deck
Yeah.
based
Yes.
on reacting to how the other player is
Yeah.
playing. Yeah, okay.
So, and that's tournament only, obviously. If you're playing a best of X match, right? You can swap it in. So like a sideboard card, very common one is like Rest in Peace, for example. This is an enchantment that says, basically it says your opponent can't use their graveyard, right?
Oh, yeah. I think I
The
remember
reason
that
it's in your sideboard, is because, well, you're not only a very small subset of opponents care about using their graveyard.
Yeah, are they
or
zombie players
or like are
whatever?
affected enough. Yeah, exactly. Or they're affected by it enough that it matters. So
Yeah, your sideboards
you
are for shutting down specific
right.
strategies.
And I would argue that this is not quote unquote interesting. This is very linear, right? There's some interesting things about like which of these graveyard hates are the best, and which of these, how many should I include, and what are the chances of getting them. But at the end of the day, the cards themselves, I don't find it interesting because it's very, very obvious what they do. They don't really provide much creative application. They don't really interact with anything else. They just have a very, very linear application, and then when you need them, you put them in.
Okay, yeah, it's like a hard counter play.
Yeah, it's a hard counter. Exactly. That's a word that reminds me of some impressions people have when switching from Warcraft 3 to StarCraft 2. Actually, Warcraft 3 didn't have hard counters, and StarCraft 2 does have hard counters. That's maybe an interesting topic as well.
Yeah, I wish
anyway.
I could speak more knowledgeably about it, but yeah.
Anyway, there's another, in fighting games, there's a sort of similar example where there are some types of characters that focus really hard on a certain part of the game. These are zoners and grapplers, among others, right? So Sejam has a video about why players specifically hate when zoners and grapplers are the best characters.
Okay.
And the argument goes that these are characters that super, super heavily go all in on one sort of niche aspect of the game. So if you imagine like Ryu fighting Ken, like Ryu can be a zoner by throwing fireballs, but he's not really that good at it, right? Like you can't really win.
That's not his main strength.
He's like an all-around character that can do, but he doesn't really have a single targeted strategy that's like dominant, right? When a character that is a zoner or a grappler. So zoners are characters that run away, right, and keep you away, and grapplers are big guys that walk in and can only do damage in melee range, but basically they get in and then they basically do a vortex, and either you keep them out and you win, or you get in the vortex and you die.
Yeah, they got to get close. And zoners are almost the opposite. They're trying to keep you in a different zone or out of their zone.
Right. Exactly. These are characters that don't play the quote unquote normal game, right? When you play against Zangief, you're no longer playing, like, it's a very different game than you play against Ryu. All of a sudden, it's all about, okay, I can't let this character get close to me, or I will have a high chance of dying. In other words, they turn every character they play against into a zoner, right?
Okay.
Right, and zoners are the opposite. Zoners turn every character they play against into a rushdown character, right? You have to either, if you can't compete with them at zoning, and they are made so that you can't compete with them at zoning unless you're playing the same character or whatever, right? You have to get in. Like your normal game plan becomes abandoned, and you have to hyper focus on this one idea, which is either getting towards them or getting away from them.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that sounds interesting to me.
Yeah, it's a good video. I recommend it.
No, but I mean that. To me, zoners and grapplers seem like a good addition, is what I'm saying. So why do people hate them?
Right. Well, they don't hate them, but they hate when they're top tier because the
representative
reason,
not of the whole game or something.
Right. Because well, I think it's multiple reasons, but one of them is you can no longer play your normal plan, right? Or another maybe that's not even true. You can no longer do everything that your character is meant to do, really. You have to hyper lean into one specific interaction. Right? These are
when
characters
going
that
against
narrow the
them,
game
yeah.
down to one interaction, right? And ignore because they're so strong in the alternative that you have to play for this one specific interaction.
Okay.
And when they're top tier, that means they don't even necessarily lose when they achieve this one interaction, right? The reason, like, if they were balanced, if they were like mid tier, in other words, a balanced character with strength and weaknesses, that means plenty of characters can exploit their clear weakness and they're not that good. If they're really good, that means even when you try to exploit their weaknesses, they don't lose necessarily, and or their strengths become super strong. So it becomes very frustrating to play against because not only do you have to focus on, like, not only do you have to abandon your training, basically, right? Like, you can no
this
longer
is a certain
necessarily
part of your training.
Right. But like, not only can you not necessarily, like many, I guess it's not universal, but many characters can no longer do what they might want to do.
Yes. Right?
Okay. So many characters experience this frustration of not being able to do what you want to do, and if they're top tier, it's especially annoying because even when you put them in what they're supposed to be weak at, you don't win. So you have to do what you don't want to do, and you sometimes lose.
Or that's the impression you have. I mean, this is the whole
right,
top tier thing.
Right. This is obviously an impression thing, right?
But that is, I get that. Okay.
So that's. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say a friend I play in Street Fighter throughout my life is a very grappler heavy player, so I'm very used to fighting grapplers.
Right. And I think it's good for, like you said, it's good for them to exist, but there is a lot of perceived frustration, more than normal, when they are super strong. Right?
Yeah. I think
okay. That's a good point. But that's just an example of why I think if you want to really lead into this idea of like a situational, like one thing is obviously really strong in this situation, I don't necessarily think it leads to good results. And they didn't do it anyway, although they said they were going to, I guess. Although I should probably put less stock into what they actually said because it sounds like a spin job. But
I mean, that's my it seems that way.
No, I agree with you.
I mean, you should always question the words of the developer. Maybe not as much as the words of a politician or a lawyer or a marketing person, but maybe you should actually, because if they got good marketing people, you got to be careful.
You know what's so annoying? This is a total tangent. A lot of news, a lot of like transparent, objective news reporting by out of necessity reports like statements, for example, from the Russian government. Like anytime someone
don't get me started
does
on
anything, they're like required, right, for fairness, to like report what the official statement of the Russian government is.
You're saying Russian government. I think it's funny that the news just reprints things that the American government say, or the military say, or the police
that's also
say.
True. Yeah.
Police who have been caught time and time and time again being liars, and the news media is still like, yep, the police said this, and that is the first fact we will give you.
And it's frustrating because it's not that it's the biased media doing this, right? It's that like in order to try to achieve integrity and like give people a platform to respond, you end up posting a bunch of clearly lies, right?
Well,
because
journalists could do a lot better at questioning or putting statements in context for those groups, and they don't, because there is a cultural expectation that these groups don't lie. They're the authorities. So I think a lot of news organizations are scared to be seen as questioning that. You know what I mean? Yeah,
that is unfortunately fair. We'll save that for our politics episode.
Okay. They're all politics
police
episodes.
Community relations in the United States.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Hot topic these days.
And we can put it in context of cop games like True Crime.
Like GTA.
No, where you play a
Oh, a
cop.
true crime.
True
Oh, I
crime.
see.
GTA is
Yeah,
the opposite. It's the anti-cop game.
it's true. Okay, I want to try to wrap this up before before we go into hour 4 here.
Okay.
So I'm gonna, so that was situation based. So what about the other thing that happens when you leave it to be a free market, basically, which is performance based, right? Like you just set up a system, you don't lean too hard in one direction or other, and you let the players figure it out,
Uh-huh.
right? Now, normally you would imagine that optimally you want a system where it's just preference based, right? Like the player can just go off vibes and pick whatever they think is most fun, and you don't have to worry too much about performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that's like I've been saying, I don't think that's super realistic, and I don't think that's
Certainly not for
super
this type of game,
right,
and not for every
right for
player.
this type, right. And we'll talk about preference based at the end, but why does performance based evaluation metrics happen? Because you put something in front of them that requires performance, right?
Yeah.
I think that's
And
now.
it's like you
There's
said,
other
it's
reasons.
easy to look. I mean, the obvious metric is just staring you in the face,
Yes,
right?
right, exactly. Now you might think, oh well, isn't this just like people picking which car has the highest horsepower? Right? Like, I mean, kind of. That could be a
Uh,
part of it, right? But
yeah, but
that's
it's not like you. It's not like everyone is racing cars. Like if they were racing
exactly
cars, maybe. But
right. And in this case, the people involved in this case are either are racing cars or want to race cars, right?
yes, yes,
And when you put them in a situation where you ask them to race a car, you can't be like, well, don't pick the car with the biggest horsepower as a starting point. Just pick
yeah. Don't
whatever you
race.
want.
You don't need to race quite that fast. you want.
Right.
You just got to be fast enough, and then everything else
Right.
you should feel good about it.
And even though that's true, it's unreasonable to expect people to start from that point of view,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
and
it
like
takes a
people in a competitive environment just don't usually. Yeah, it's not.
right,
It's yeah.
right.
We've said it.
So if in the ideal world, the other one that was outlined, if everything performed the same, obviously this would be impossible. That's in reality, that's not a realistic goal, I think. But anyway, the main point here is like, well, if you're looking for something performance based, shouldn't your performance just be success? Like, shouldn't you just take this is basically a very results based approach, right? Like you ignore all the process in the middle and just say, well, did you succeed?
Yeah.
And by that, in this case, it means, did you get the rewards? And if it did, then why are you even thinking about it?
Right.
Like, don't worry about anything else. If you succeeded, just stop thinking and just have fun.
Yeah. I mean, are there development ways to strengthen that idea, to minimize the remainder damage you did to not being meaningful?
Right. It's a good point. That's a good way of putting it, actually, the remainder damage. So one of the things is Lost Ark, for example, doesn't allow finds using a damage meter to be ban worthy, right? They will
Yep.
ban you for using a damage meter.
Yep.
That is one way to sort of very aggressively try to curb at all, right?
Okay.
Like
yeah, there you go.
the
Right.
the goal post is still there, which is success, and there's a little bit that the game gives you about how well you did, but you're not allowed to go deeper than that.
And WoW, are there like leaderboards for raid damage?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay. Well, there you
Big
go.
big leaderboards. There's
Yeah.
big leaderboards. There's leaderboards for individual performance. There's leaderboards for performance by class, and you can see your own percentile, like I mentioned.
Yeah.
Same with Final Fantasy, all of that, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So if that exists, then yeah, it's not surprising you see people basing things on
Right.
damage or whatever.
Right. That's the same. And I just want to, for this one, I think the easiest comparison is a speedrunner, right? Like, I'm sure in the well, maybe not. Well, no, you mentioned some unpleasant people that have tried to join your community, but
Yeah. Every now and then.
there's in every speedrunning community, I'm sure there's people that come in and care way too much about the leaderboard, right?
Yes.
And you're just like, okay, like we understand that it's competitive and the leaderboard is there for us to compete, but you gotta chill. You
Yeah,
can't.
it's like you're kind of defeating the purpose of.
Right.
It's not fun anymore when you do this.
And this is the problem with performance-based metrics in MMOs as well. It's almost exactly the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just like, okay, like you do want, like for example, I'm very annoyed by Lost Ark not having the DPS meter because I want more information, right? I want to know like, hey, what percentage of my damage is this skill, and if I change it for this other skill, how much does that change? I want more detailed
Right, just for
information that I
improving
can't
how
get.
you're doing. Yeah.
Right. And that's sort of, as Arthur has mentioned in that video that we'll talk about next time or some other time. That's sort of the intention. That's the best, quote unquote, best by most, agreed on by most sensible people out there. That's the best use of the DPS meter and the logs, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're looking for improvement. You're looking for where did I make mistakes? Where was I inefficient? Or
Could you
you're
do
testing
that
things.
obfuscating the numbers somehow? Would it make a difference? Like have
So
bars showing you different things relative to one another only?
Oh yeah, for sure. So but then you're at the mercy of the company, right? Because Lost Ark, you could be like, oh well, you can have a DPS meter that we make for you inside the training room.
Yeah.
But or even they could have a DPS meter and be like, so here's an example of how this can cascade, right? So let's say, oh well, you can have a DPS meter for yourself, right? But if they let you do that, you can imagine that what would happen is, okay, in order to join this group or join this guild, you need to post your DPS meter that was meant for only yourself, post a screenshot, right? And you can see how this can cascade if your goal is to sort of avoid it in the first place.
Yes. Okay.
Now, that being said, you might say it's very, the most obvious argument, the Marco Polo argument is like, well, people will do that anyway. People that want to gatekeep people are just going to find any metric that they can to gatekeep people. But every tool that you take away that makes it hard to do that leads to some reduction in the number of times that happens, right? You'll
I
never,
agree.
when you sort of try to solve a problem, your first goal in fact, your goal I think should never be, how do I completely eliminate this problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more like, what are the easiest steps and most effective steps to reduce the problem? How many of those can I implement? At what point is the problem
giving
small
a
enough?
quantitative tool to decide if you want to kick someone out of your group,
Right.
is that any better than whatever other metric you would use without it?
Right. And is it easier for the people that you want to prevent from gatekeeping other people, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Because there's tons of gatekeeping in Lost Ark still. There's tons of discussion about like what classes are the worst. But instead of being based off of a sim, it is sometimes, it's based off of theoretical damage that people calculated. And it's based off of like, how many times do I feel like I've seen this class do well on the MVP screen, right? You might argue that's no different, but it's a little bit better, maybe. I guess the Lost Ark stance is a little, I don't fully agree with it, but I will say that it's probably a little bit better, right?
Thanks for letting me play in your group.
Oh, no problem. I mean, we got carried back when we were in there, so
yeah.
So I guess the point we're getting at here is like, success is determined, like, why can't the metric just be success? Because success is determined partly by the player, but also by the game, right? Just because you got the rewards that the developers, quote unquote, intended for you to get, doesn't mean you succeeded by your own metric or by the metric of your friends, right? I already gave the example earlier, but when I killed Valton and I died, I wasn't happy because I don't feel like I somehow don't feel like I deserved it, right? But basically, like I felt like I failed, even though
you didn't do it right,
successfully got the
at the very least you could do better. You can do better,
right? And at the end of the day, it boils down to, why everything we do in the game is completely arbitrary, right? Who is to say that the arbitrary goal that the developer put in front of you is somehow better or worse than the arbitrary goal that you set for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably better crafted,
Right.
but
It's probably better crowd. It's
doesn't
probably more
mean
fun.
it's,
Whatever, right?
however you find fun in it is to you.
But as a but as a developer, yelling at your audience and telling them to play the game in this other way seems meaningless, right? Because
Yeah,
like
it's not going to work.
everything is pointless. Just people are going to do what they want to do, Nintendo,
Yeah.
and what's the point of fighting it, right? You can do things to try to guide it in a certain way, but you can't really fight it that much.
Uh, well, hang on. You can definitely fight things with gameplay changes. Are you saying not with
Oh
just
yeah, you can influence
talking?
things, but you can't. Yeah, I guess by fight I mean you can't just
You
tell
can't
people that they're
100%
wrong.
certain get people
Yeah,
to do the exact thing you want them to.
right, right.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay.
Some people are just gonna be really weird and do
And hopefully you've designed your game to, maximize the cool shit you've done in this game
right.
to
Yes,
for the players, and it doesn't happen accidentally. It's what they want to do.
right, exactly. And I guess what I mean is like sometimes that's not what you expect, and sometimes you feel like maybe they are doing what they want to do is self-destructive, which may be true, but yelling at them is not a solution, basically, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
telling
yeah,
people you need to stop kicking people because they're performing 2% worse. That's
yeah. It's
it's
yeah,
probably
it's
something,
meaningless.
right? But it's not really a okay. So the last thing is, what if you could have a perfect situation where everything was balanced and you could just you allow players to pick purely off of vibes.
Uh huh.
Um, it sounds great. Maybe
All right. Well, that's
you
it
can
for
do
today's
whatever you want.
episode.
Uh, but this isn't quite. I thought about this, and I feel like this is not quite as utopian as it sort of appears to be. So first of all, balance. Like in reality, this is not possible, right? Like there's going to be some areas, like unless you have of a uniform game, like for example, not even checkers is quote unquote balanced, right? Because one player has to move first, right?
Hmm.
But unless you have a checkers like uniform game, um, some things are just going to be stronger than other things, right? The more
Yeah.
complexity you have, the harder it is to keep everything. In.
Yep.
But let's even ignore it for a second. Let's say they did perform either close enough or uh, either the same or close enough that it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
I think to uh, I think one of the things that comes up here is not everybody. So how would you decide as a player? Well, you go off vibes, and what that means is you would, for example, try everything and just pick whatever suited you the best for whatever reason,
Hmm.
right? Here's the thing though. So I guess I just thought this example, which is like, imagine you're trying to buy a car, right?
Hmm.
So there are all kinds of metrics that you can measure a car by. But let's say if those things aren't a big deal and you just wanted to find the car that feels the best to drive.
Hmm.
Well, that's actually pretty hard because then you end up having to drive like 500 cars,
Yeah.
right?
Well, maybe not that many, but yeah.
Well, okay, yeah, maybe not that. Yeah, you have to drive way too many cars if that's the only thing you care about, right?
Uh huh.
You need to have some sort of starting point to make that decision, right? And that means you need to measure something. So, for example, you can do something really dumb and be like top 10 cars of 2022 and just try those, right?
Yep.
Or you can know something more about yourself and be like, okay, I like sedans and I want a car that doesn't have a lot of emissions because I'm a dirty liberal.
Uh huh. Uh huh.
And then that narrows your starting point down to a bunch, right?
Yeah. 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 You have
So
preferences that narrow things down.
that's sort of like, right, you have preferences, you already know what you're into, and if you start in a game you can also sort of do that, right? Because there, you can sort of make assessments about like in other games I like X, and in this game like something is similar to that. But generally you want, like, players want some sort of starting point where they're trying to figure out what has the best vibes for them. And the other problem that arises is that I lost my train of thought completely.
Well, uh doesn't that all get thrown out the window as soon as you're in a competitive game though? Like
Kind of.
the I mean, depending on who you are, but if
Mhm.
if because it's no longer just like what feels best if the goal that's in my face is winning or being
Right.
better than other people, and that's when I'm going to start
So,
looking at what other people do and tier lists
right.
and such.
So, like, one reason this sounds ideal is that, like, well, if you could have a perfect world where so in this case, if all the legendaries performed about the same,
Hmm.
right? So in the answer, he says, like, well, why is it's our fault that the legendaries, some are better than others. We should make them all about the same,
Hmm.
right? Um, and so in a competitive situation, well, yeah, like, it's hard to. That's seems unlikely to be possible. It's not possible, or, like, the more differences there are between them, the harder it gets, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
so if
gameplay
they're all
differences.
right, if they all have the same number, obviously they're all the same, but then you just have one thing, right? So if you want more, but you want to choose between them, then you start having to make decisions, right? So, and the other thing is, like, when you're picking out vibes, they have to have different vibes, right? Which
Naturally.
uh, otherwise they're the same. So
Do you in WoW can you see not just by examining them and looking at their inventory, but can you see different loot items on your character model? You can, right?
yes, yes,
Okay.
but you can
Okay.
also change them to other stuff. So you can, like,
Like
reskin or
skins on the
transmog.
same.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, so
yeah,
it's still a certain item, but you color it differently or change it.
yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
but
okay. Well,
that is
that's
part of
different.
it, right? Like, in League of Legends, some you can play a champion because you like how they play, or a lot of people just play a champion because they like the new skin that
Yeah,
this champion
yeah, yeah,
got.
yeah, yeah.
That's
That's what I'm getting at, and doing
right.
the what you just described in WoW, kind of it takes a lot of it takes some away from the value of the cosmetic, I think, but
Right.
uh,
The thing is, in WoW, everything you can reskin everything, so
yeah,
it
okay,
actually
that's part of it.
is really real. But uh, so they can't be the same. That means they have to change gameplay somehow, right?
Uh huh.
Or they don't. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the goal, though. Like, if they were just passive and they all did the same amount of damage, I mean, I think that's actually okay. Well, I guess it's probably not okay because it'd be very boring. But let's assume that they have to change gameplay because that's the only way the vibes feel different, right? Otherwise, it's the same vibes.
Uh huh.
So if they change gameplay, you actually still don't solve the problem. So even if you had a perfect world where everything was balanced and every legendary changed gameplay so that you have a different vibe, but but they were all still did the exact same theoretical damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that means everyone can can use anything they want based on what feels the best for them.
Mm-hmm.
This is a problem, actually, because if they're different, then that means one of them is more different than the other. And that's the one you might want. And that's the exact same problem. Not the
Um.
exact same problem. It's less of a performance problem, but it still causes a scarcity problem where if your
Yeah.
gameplay is centralized around this and you want to play the game in that way, now you need that thing, right?
Yeah. This is a we should come back to this discussion just from a broader perspective, like across games, because I'm really curious because this isn't just a WoW problem. I'm assuming this is.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of want to know how developers address this, or what the theories are behind
It's a
how to
universal game.
introduce RNG elements that are gameplay specific. So yeah,
This is a core RNG problem, right?
yeah, yeah.
even if you could balance everything perfectly, if you have scarcity, then that means you can't have something. Some people can't have something, and you need to think about that, right?
Yeah.
The last thing, we're way over time here. The last thing is, in reality, you can't. That's not like. There's no way everything will actually perform at the same level, right? Something has to be better than some other thing, or everything is way too similar to each other, right? Imagine a world where they try to make everything perform at the same level. In fact, this is one of my gripes with old League of Legends balancing. Let's say you are an inventive player. You're a lab man. Okay, lab man goes to the lab, and for their favorite class, and they find a way. It's like, oh, I can do this cool, technical, difficult new rotation to get a small damage boost, 3%, very small. Well, now Labman's new rotation performs better than all the other classes who perform the same or are supposed to perform the same. So they nerf this thing that was just discovered because everything has to be the same.
Okay.
That's a problem, right? Like,
because it doesn't it discourages that sort of exploration.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Right. It's you're discouraging players from trying to get better, essentially, right? You're discouraging players from sharing information.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. You're certainly like, if you find something you don't want, if you find something like that, you don't want people to find out about it. But it's like, but in this example specifically, there's just as much chance. Well, maybe not in this example, but generally, there's just the sort of the line is that there's just as much chance your shit is going to get buffed as it's going to get nerfed. But in this example, you're talking about something that is like why would they? How would they allow that to stand? You know what I mean? Like, what should the response to somebody finding a thing like that?
Good point. Well, it depends on the situation, right? Because the thing that is found, quote unquote found, can be in this case small, or it can be a game-breaking bug, and one of them needs to be addressed, and the other, I would intuitively say you should let happen, right? And the way to have this stand is to not feel the need to have everything perform at the exact same level, right?
I think remember that the goal is not to have everything perform at the same level. It's to have the perception of it.
Right, exactly.
So something like this could stand out, right? If it's like, if there is, I guess it just depends on how big of the advantage it confers. Because if it's big enough, they'll be like, well, if only this character can do it or whatever, we have to adjust it down, right?
Now so what you end up having is you have a threshold, right? Like, I guess Ian also mentioned this idea, which is like natural variance, although this isn't variance, right? But you have a threshold, a margin of error. That's like, okay, well, we want everyone to do approximately 100 damage. But if a class does 107, 110, 101 damage, that's okay. We don't need to immediately fix that, right? We can sort of let it play out and see if that's actually
a problem.
So you you see if it's actually a problem, right? You don't take a metric-based approach. You take a holistic approach, right? You see if it causes everyone to switch to this class, right? Or you see if this class starts dominating and pushing other classes out of the situation. You basically try to solve an ecosystem level problem rather than a single metric problem.
Right. Yep, makes sense.
That would be the hope. So basically, however, if you send that idea backwards, you end up with this realization that you can't have everything perform at the same level. Otherwise, you get that problem, right? So if you can't have everything perform at the same level, then that means some things are better than other things, and people are going to gravitate towards those things that are better than other things, and that's okay.
I think so, right? I mean,
you would think so, right?
Okay. Wait, there's a but here?
No, it's an open question, right? Because you sort of start with the idea that, well, the platonic ideal would be everything performs about the same and you can just pick on vibes, right? But if you follow it to the end, you get to the other idea, which is you need to have it be okay that some things are better than other things. And then you go
Yes.
backwards and you end up with, you realize that, okay, well, some things have to be better than other things, and that has to be okay, probably in most situations, maybe not in like chess, right? But in
Yeah, I
this
mean,
kind of,
I think it you have to put it that in that desire in context of whatever your other goals are. So,
right,
if it's like, well, above all, putting the idea of balance aside, what we really want is people to play a wider breadth of champions.
right,
You know what I
yes,
mean?
right,
So
yeah,
they make those
exactly,
decisions based on that probably way more than let's make sure every champion is balanced, because it's just not
right,
that's not realistic.
right.
And there's
That's a
something,
great,
and I like that vagary, that sort of, by not saying everything is perfectly balanced and that there are gameplay decisions you can make that will change how you think they're balanced or surprise people. I think there is a certain attitude of there's things to discover in here, because
right.
you made your
Hmm.
your example of the difficult rotation that gets nerfed, but I think there's enough uh, vagueness, and there's enough mystery that some champions in some situations could be played differently, and that's happened enough times in the meta history that I think it at least in League it still was alive when I was there.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. There's By having more complexity, you get more imbalance, but you
Yeah.
also get more discovery, right?
Yeah,
This
and
is a
complexity can be just good for giving
Yeah,
deeper gameplay, more interesting decisions to make, right?
right. This is basically a very, very long-winded podcast to make the point that perfect balance should not is not the ideal goal, right? Perfect balance actually leads to, in many cases, if you really want to make it perfect, it leads to a lot of bad things as
And
well.
especially in the context of how games are developed and how they want to continue developing them, is like you're constantly you're going to be adding and changing content. Like that's
Right,
you're gonna add new stuff. So just by definition, balance is impossible unless it's sort of a
right,
rolling target.
right, exactly. Balance is relative, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And
and the
again,
purpose,
it all comes down to I want to feel like I wasn't ripped off by buying this champion or
right?
whatever. I want to or making
Or
this 60-hour decision or whatever.
in my opinion, it's all about distracting yourself from the heat death of the universe and how
I
everything is
mean, yeah, if
ultimately
we
in
if we
vain.
pull back enough to the goals of games, then yes, absolutely. Inventing meaning to our short lives
Yep. Okay.
through
We
numbers
should.
going up and badges being awarded.
I love. Actually, we know. Are you a achievement collector?
I used to be.
Oh, I see.
I
Okay.
don't think I
Achieve.
don't spend the same amount of time on games as I used to.
Yeah, I see. Achievement collecting was one of the things that always puzzled me. I mean, not at a high level, but at a individual level.
Like why
Uh,
people do it.
yeah.
Uh, I mean, I'd say it's the same reason I speedrun is a
Yeah.
game I like. I want to keep playing, and giving me little
Ah. Okay.
goals to do is keeps me interested.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
That makes
so
sense.
I'd 100% a GTA and get all the achievements because they're like extra challenges to a game I don't want to stop.
Okay. That's fair. I never thought
So
about it
there,
from that perspective.
take that.
Got him. You got me.
I did.
Okay.
There
I
was a
want to.
there was a brief time that I would, when I worked at Activision, that because there were a lot of like you could get a lot of free games working at game
Yep.
companies, and not always the company's games, but just like whatever random crap people got at whatever event. So you have
Uh
tons of
huh.
weird shit, and I would find games the cheap shitty games that gave all the achievements really fast. I'd do a
Ah.
couple of
Okay.
those. Like famously, one
I
of the
see.
Avatar Last Airbender games, you could get 1,000 achievement points in like 10 minutes.
I see.
So that's something different. That's just I want to see a number go up.
that's optimal. That's optimal achievement
and
point.
compare to my friends and say, look, I got 10,000.
Okay, I just want to wrap up with the last thought really quick, which is at the end of the day, I think the confusing thing about this is it's not clear to me whether you were supposed to get all the legendaries or not.
Uh-huh.
I feel like the systems indicate that you are supposed to get all of them, and what they said indicates that you are supposed to get all of them, but you couldn't get all of them. So, like, something didn't line up here. We don't have to go into the details. This is we'll leave this as an exercise for the reader, but like, I think maybe player retention dictated that no, they shouldn't get all the legendaries, but everyone else designed systems such that oh no, it's fine, they'll get all of them eventually.
Yeah,
Which
you
I
may
guess
be
is
totally right.
true.
They
But
may just be tuning it on player retention,
I
something.
I think yeah
And
I
maybe enough of the solo players do like that system that it sort of evens out. Or
very possible.
yeah.
This whole tuning from player retention thing was a big hot topic in Legion and especially in BFA, which came after, because those two expansions made people really miserable, but had a ton of this kind of gambling RNG infinite scaling mechanic that
Uh-huh.
probably helped a lot of player retention, but
Yeah, there's a
made
lot about
community
that that
members very
works, right?
unhappy.
Those
Yeah,
are
it does.
good hooks. But
But
and there's always the
do
question
they
of, you brought it up earlier, but how real, how important to the company is the group of players this is affecting negatively, right? Versus
mm,
those that it's not affecting, and how loud are those voices in the broader community? So if and how much is this going to really drive those players away versus is this just
right.
another, ear flake over time that will add up, but maybe it's not going to actually bump any people off by itself. I don't
In
know.
fact, the point is that it doesn't drive any players away, right? It like forcibly retains them
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
until they burn out and die, right? And I think that's
Yes, they want by
it's
the
like this.
end.
It's cigarette. It's a cigarette company.
Yeah,
If
they
you
want you
go
to
all the way
be
into this,
your wallet to be empty and your body to be a decayed husk.
yes, right, and that. Oh well, that's obviously an extreme case, but I do think that the mechanics did kind of feel like that in from the vibe I get, and obviously I didn't play, so I'm purely influenced by influencers as it were. But
Yeah, I mean it's quote unquote common knowledge in gaming that the most important thing is to increase time. Get people,
hmm,
if people are playing more, that's good. Then it doesn't matter if it's some hate playing or playing that they don't want to do. I'm not saying
is
that's
that
right. I'm not saying that's right, but that is sort of a general, like, we prioritize people playing the game more because that means people buy more, people tell their friends
mm,
more, uh, people create groups more, etc., etc.
see? I do get that, but I wonder how short. Like obviously that's a spectrum, and I wonder if you go way too hard, how short-sighted that is, because
Oh yeah,
I think it's very similar to this idea that like all publicity is good publicity, right? Like all publicity is good publicity for a while, but pretty soon you become the next crazy reality TV star that is broke.
yeah. No, it's yeah. I don't agree. I mean, I don't agree with all PR is good PR. It's definitely not.
Well, yeah, that is true. But
Uh, yeah.
similarly, I don't agree that necessarily all time in game is good time in game. Maybe it's
Agreed. I agree. I agree with
yeah,
that. But I think
and I
when you're
don't mean
looking
that
at
from a
things from
moral.
like a macro perspective, that's what
Yeah,
they do.
and I don't even mean from a moral perspective. I just mean from like a long-term revenue perspective. Maybe it's not good to try to force people to stay in your game longer than there's
I
stuff for them to do in the
My
game. But
understanding is generally it is worth it to
really,
their long
okay,
term revenue to pull out
interesting.
some of those stops, but it is a constant balancing act, right? Like every time we put out a bit of bad news at Riot, it was like we had to sort of consider what positive news was coming out and what if too many negative things came out in a row or
Mm,
too many things happened to a specific champion in a row. Like we knew those things were most likely to have people drop versus a little bit of bad news every now and then. They're more
right,
like they're less likely to be like, that's it, I'm done.
right. I see. Yeah, maybe this is an interesting topic. This idea of like how far can you push the idea of just getting people to play your game no matter what?
Yeah,
Um,
because remember, most if you're people want to play the game, like they want to play the
well,
game. They want it.
yes,
You don't think
we
so?
should. Yeah, I do think so, but I think if you optimize for this, you can get negative results if you. So I think maybe BFA would be an interesting example if I learn more about exactly what happened.
Battlefields is that what it was?
Battle for Azeroth.
Oh,
It's
Battle for Azeroth.
the expansion after Legion.
God, I don't even remember that name.
I
Okay.
and maybe there's more better examples I can get. But like on the other hand, maybe this is a casino. I don't know. Let's talk about it. Let's workshop it. This is a good topic.
Yeah, and there's the other element on top of just like what kind of aside from revenue, what is the goodwill from a particular player at a
Right.
particular moment? Because someone who is like really good, feels great about your game and your company, they're going to do a lot more for you than someone you're forcing to stay in the game.
At the end of the day, though, you still need to measure that through revenue, right? It's just harder to measure
Yeah, yeah.
because like, at the end of the day, that has to turn into like, well, this guy or this individual spread a bunch of good news for us on YouTube, and he has 30,000 views, and that probably translates into some amount of purchases. But if that doesn't, then I don't know. It's hard
Yeah.
to it's hard to imagine that it doesn't have any effect, but
Well, I mean, most game companies do try to, and it's pretty much, I mean, it's very difficult, if not impossible. They try to boil down every new game, every new piece of content, every new gameplay addition to like what is the effect on
a number.
our
Yeah,
profit and loss statement.
I
And
love
that's
bottom line.
yeah, and Riot early on, I think they did that. They did that at the very high level, and they obfuscated that from most people. They didn't want people to
Interesting.
focus on that as
Right.
oh, what makes the most money is the best decision. They were like, no, what makes players play more and be happy are the best decision. So but
Yeah,
I
makes
think
sense.
as things maybe as the cocaine and sex worker days got a little bit more in the rearview mirror, they're probably being more careful about that. Would be my
Yeah,
guess. They're being
that
more
makes sense.
specific about that. Whereas when I was there, they were just kind of like, whatever. Spend 5 years just figuring out what kind of game you want to make, that kind of thing.
The ongoing economy crunch is making a lot of people realize the reality of that, right? Like you
Uh,
can because a lot of companies are closing, restaurants
mhm.
are closing, etc. And it's like, well, they look like they were doing well, and they were very liberal with um, how much they gave back to the community,
Mhm.
right? And then
Yeah, but they
the
couldn't make
economic
it
crunch
work to
hits, and then they
stay in
and then
business.
they go under, right?
Yeah, and that's way less of a problem for the big players. Uh,
Right.
the sort of the how the economy is going or whatnot. But
Yep.
like once, I mean, in gaming, it's sadly, I guess I don't know how it is now, but 10 years ago, it was so hard to be any sort of success as an indie publisher, indie developer.
Mm.
But I don't know, maybe that's changed with I don't know, early access and Patreon and shit. I don't know. I don't know.
It is hard to imagine. Like this is part of my games don't cost enough money idea, which is like it's hard to imagine an indie game that costs like 6.99 being able to support a team of developers, right? Unless the team of developers is like size 3.
Totally. Oh yeah. I
Like it
mean,
costs 6.99. Like how many how many do you have to sell just to make a livable wage? And that's one
Games
year.
are expensive, yeah, and especially if you're paying people
Right.
appropriately. It's
Which
real,
I guess
it's
no one
real damn
does. So.
expensive. What's that?
Which I guess no one does. So
Uh, depending on what department you're in, there's
well, it's yeah.
game developers are paid a lot these days.
Well, I can believe that. Although maybe not anymore since the
But
new
maybe
flood of
that's
developers on the market.
it. May just be, but then again, I may be just thinking about like big companies, successful
Right.
companies,
Big companies are a little different, right?
and not like associate developers or whatever. It's more like the
Right.
lead developers are treated, or they're treated like celebrities.
Yeah.
All right, we should wrap it up.
All right. Thanks for listening to episode 8 of Open Betas with Regal and SwimFan. We'll see you next time.
Bye. Oh, wait. This is World of
Dante.
Warcraft. This is World of Warcraft.
Oh,
All right,
okay.
take 2.
Okay. Orc.
Job's done. That's it.
That's pretty good.
Okay.
Nintendo, 5% tint, so you can't see up in my window. These niggas don't understand me, cause I'm boss hog on candy. Top down at Maxis with a big Glock 9 handy. Pieced up, creased up, stand dressed to impress. Big boss belt buckle under my Michelin S. Oh, Gucci shades up